Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Story 1. I'm Emma, 32. I thought Gifford Pinchot National Forest was empty, until the trees shifted closer. What started as a simple weekend RV trip to clear my head after the divorce turned into something I still can't fully explain. Something that makes me check my rearview mirror every few miles even now, 3 months later. The divorce papers had been finalized on a Thursday, and by Saturday morning I was pulling my little Winnebago down Forest Road 25, desperate to put distance between myself and the hollow echo of our empty house. The GPS had cut out somewhere past Randall, but I'd been to Gifford Pinchot before, back when Mark and I were still pretending we had a future together. I knew the way to the dispersed camping areas near Iron Creek, where you could park for free and the cell towers couldn't reach you with their constant reminders of a life falling apart. The trees here were old-growth Douglas firs, some of them 8 feet across and tall enough to make you dizzy looking up. Between them, the understory was sparse, just occasional patches of salal and Oregon grape, with shafts of afternoon light cutting down through the canopy like spotlights. It should have been beautiful. It was beautiful, at first. I found a decent spot about half a mile off the main road, a small clearing with enough space for the RV and a fire ring someone had built from river rocks. The silence hit me immediately when I turned off the engine. That deep, cushioned quiet you only get in old forests, where the trees absorb sound like they're listening. After 6 months of lawyers and shouting matches and the endless drip of our dying marriage, the quiet felt like medicine. I spent the first hour getting set up, extending the awning, leveling the RV, organizing my supplies. Simple tasks that made me feel competent again, useful. The afternoon was warm for October, and I changed into shorts and a tank top, then sat outside with a beer and my sketch pad. I used to draw all the time before the marriage consumed everything. Sitting there, penciling in the rough outline of a massive fir that dominated the clearing, I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in months. That's when I noticed the trees. Not anything dramatic, just a feeling that the spacing was different than when I'd first arrived. The big fir I was sketching seemed closer to my RV, maybe 10 feet closer than it had been an hour ago. I put down my pencil and really looked around the clearing. The trees formed an uneven circle around my campsite, and I tried to remember exactly where each one had been when I'd pulled in. But that was the thing about trees. They were supposed to be permanent reference points, so you didn't really memorize their positions the way you would with something that might move. I shook it off. Stress and exhaustion could play tricks on your perception. I'd been living on caffeine and spite for months. A little spatial confusion was probably inevitable. I finished my beer and started a fire as the sun began to sink behind the canopy. The evening was perfect. I heated a can of chili over the flames and ate it watching the light fade from gold to orange to deep blue between the branches. The silence was so complete it felt alive, pressing against my eardrums like water. When full darkness came, the stars appeared in the gaps between leaves like scattered jewels. I was banking the fire when I heard the sound, a long, low creaking, like wood under stress. Old trees made noise as they cooled at night, I knew that. But this creak seemed to move around the clearing, starting from the fir I'd been sketching and traveling clockwise through the circle of trees. Each massive trunk groaned in sequence as if something enormous was settling into position. The hair on my arms stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around the clearing, but all I saw were the familiar shapes of bark and shadow. The creaking stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt expectant, waiting. "Just trees," I said aloud, my voice embarrassingly loud in the quiet. Just old trees settling. But as I climbed into the RV and locked the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that the clearing had contracted around me while I wasn't paying attention. That the trees had used the darkness to shuffle closer like shy children approaching a stranger. I woke to complete darkness and the certainty that something was wrong. My phone showed 3:17 a.m., and outside the RV's windows was a blackness so total it seemed solid. No moonlight, no starlight, nothing. Even with the curtains drawn, there should have been some ambient light seeping through, but this was the kind of darkness you found in deep caves or sensory deprivation chambers. Then I heard the breathing. Slow, deep, rhythmic. The sound of something large drawing air into massive lungs and releasing it in controlled streams. It seemed to come from all around the RV, as if the entire clearing was breathing in unison. The sound was too big, too organized to be wind through branches. I lay rigid in my narrow bed, listening. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, sometimes seeming to pause as if whatever was out there was holding its breath, listening back. During those pauses, the silence was so complete it made my ears ring. When I finally worked up the courage to peer through a gap in the curtains, the view made no sense. Instead of the familiar shapes of trees silhouetted against the night sky, I saw only darkness pressed up against the glass like black velvet. It was as if the RV had been wrapped in something that absorbed light completely. The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard a new sound, a soft scratching against the exterior walls of the RV, like fingernails against aluminum siding. The sound traveled slowly around the vehicle, starting at the rear and moving toward the front. Whatever was making it was methodical, systematic, as if it was examining the RV inch by inch. I reached for my phone to call 911, then remembered there was no signal out here. The scratching continued its circuit around the RV, pausing at the windows, the door, the roof vent. Testing, probing. When it reached the front of the RV, the scratching stopped. I held my breath, counting heartbeats. Then came 3 deliberate knocks on the door. Knock, 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 polite, patient. The kind of knock a neighbor might make when borrowing sugar. I didn't answer. I couldn't have spoken if I'd tried. My throat had locked up with terror. The knocking came again, identical in timing and intensity. When I still didn't respond, I heard what might have been a sigh, disappointed but not surprised, like a salesman used to having doors slammed in his face. The darkness outside began to lighten gradually, revealing the familiar outlines of trees. As dawn broke fully, I could see the clearing exactly as it had been the night before. No signs of disturbance, no tracks in the dirt around the RV, no scratches on the aluminum siding, but the trees were definitely closer. I was sure of it now. The big fir I'd been sketching was close enough to the RV that I could have reached out the door and touched its bark. The entire circle of trees had contracted by at least 15 feet overnight, transforming the generous clearing into a cramped space barely large enough for the RV. I dressed quickly and went outside, coffee cup in hand, trying to act normal while my mind raced. In daylight, with birds chirping and squirrels chattering in the branches, the night's events seemed almost dreamlike. But the evidence was right in front of me. Trees that had moved, that were somehow repositioning themselves around my campsite. I walked to the edge of the clearing and examined the ground around the base of the big fir. The earth was undisturbed, showing the normal pattern of fallen needles and decomposing leaves you'd expect under an old-growth tree. No exposed roots, no crater where the tree had been uprooted and replanted. The bark showed no signs of damage or stress. But I knew what I'd seen. The tree was in a different place. I spent the morning trying to rationalize it. Maybe I was remembering wrong. Maybe the stress of the divorce had affected my spatial memory more than I'd realized. Maybe this was the start of some kind of nervous breakdown, and I should pack up and drive straight to a hospital. But the alternative, that the trees were actually moving, was impossible. I decided to stay another night. If it happened again, I'd have proof I wasn't losing my mind. If nothing happened, I could chalk it up to stress and exhaustion and go home with a funny story about camping alone and letting my imagination run wild. I spent the day hiking some of the nearby trails, trying to tire myself out enough to sleep soundly. The forest during the day was magnificent. Cathedral, quiet, with that green-gold light that made everything look enchanted. I saw deer, heard woodpeckers hammering in the distance, watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. Normal forest things, peaceful things, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Several times I spun around, certain I'd glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, only to see trees standing innocent and still. Once, I could have sworn I heard footsteps matching my pace on the trail behind me, but when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. As afternoon wore into evening, I found myself reluctant to return to camp. The idea of another night in that contracting clearing made my stomach clench with dread. But I'd come here to prove something to myself, that I was strong enough to be alone. Capable of independence after years of marriage had made me feel small and dependent. Running away after one weird night would feel like admitting defeat. So I went back. The clearing looked exactly as I'd left it, except that the trees seemed to loom larger in the evening light. I made dinner, started a fire, tried to read a book. But my attention kept drifting to the circle of trunks around me, measuring distances, looking for changes in position. As darkness fell, I retreated to the RV and locked the door. I left the curtains open this time, determined to see what happened. The campfire died down to glowing coals, casting just enough light to make out the silhouettes of the nearest trees. At first, nothing seemed different. The forest settled into its nighttime quiet, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. I began to relax, even to feel a little foolish for working myself up over what was probably just stress-induced confusion. Then the creaking started again, the same sequence as the night before. A long, slow groan traveling clockwise around the clearing. But this time I was watching, and I saw it happen. The trees moved. Not quickly, not obviously, but with the patient inexorability of our hands on a clock. In the dim glow from the dying fire, I watched the massive trunks shift positions with tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments. A few inches here, a foot there. The movement was so gradual it was hypnotic, like watching continents drift. The big fir directly in front of the RV swayed slightly on its root system, then settled a little closer to my door. Another tree, a cedar I hadn't paid much attention to, angled inward by a few degrees. All around the clearing, the giants were repositioning themselves with the focused patience of chess players contemplating their next move. I sat frozen at the dinette table, watching through the front window as my campsite slowly, steadily shrank around me. The trees didn't uproot themselves. Nothing so dramatic. Instead, they seemed to stretch toward the center of the clearing, their trunks bending just slightly from true vertical, their root systems shifting underground with sounds like distant thunder. The process took hours. I watched until my eyes burned, dozed fitfully with my head on the table, woke to find the trees noticeably closer. By dawn, the clearing had contracted by another 10 feet on all sides. And that's when I noticed something else. The trees weren't just moving closer. They were getting taller. I was sure the big fir had been maybe 80 feet tall when I'd arrived. Now it stretched at least 100 feet into the sky, its crown lost in morning mist. The other trees had grown proportionally, creating a canopy so dense that only scattered fragments of sky were visible between the branches. The clearing was becoming a room, a green-walled room with a living ceiling, and I was trapped at its center. I packed, frantically, throwing clothes and supplies into bags without bothering to fold or organize anything. The rational part of my mind was screaming that trees couldn't move, couldn't grow 60 feet overnight, couldn't behave like predators herding prey. But rationality was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Whatever was happening here, I needed to leave before the trees closed ranks completely. The RV started on the first try, and I'd never been so grateful to hear an engine turn over. I put it in reverse and backed toward what I remembered as the entrance to the clearing. The trees were too close together. Where there should have been a gap wide enough for the RV, I found a space barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. The massive trunks had interlaced their lower branches, creating an almost solid barrier of wood and foliage. I tried 3 other directions, searching for an opening large enough to escape through. But the trees had formed a perfect circle around me, their trunks now close enough together that I could touch 2 different trees simultaneously by stretching out my arms. I was trapped. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, engine running, staring at the wall of bark that surrounded me. The trees swayed slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel at ground level, and I found myself wondering if they were communicating with each other, planning, deciding what to do with their catch. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. I had food for several more days, water for a week if I was careful. I could survive in here for a while, but eventually supplies would run out. Eventually, I'd have to find a way through the trees or what? Wait for them to decide I'd suffered enough? Hope they'd open their ranks and let me go? Try to squeeze through the gaps on foot and abandon the RV? That last option made my skin crawl. The idea of walking between those massive trunks, feeling their bark scrape against my shoulders, their branches catching at my hair, it was like imagining being swallowed alive. I turned off the engine and went back inside the RV. There had to be a logical explanation for what was happening. Trees didn't move. Trees didn't hunt. Trees didn't grow 3 feet in a single night. I was experiencing some kind of breakdown, some stress-induced hallucination or perceptual distortion. But if that were true, why did everything else seem normal? I could read the labels on my food cans. I could remember my phone number, my address, the date. I could perform simple math problems and recite poetry I'd memorized in college. I wasn't losing my mind. I was experiencing something impossible. I tried calling 911 again, knowing there was no signal but desperate enough to try anyway. Nothing. I tried the emergency beacon on my GPS unit, but it couldn't lock onto satellites through the dense canopy overhead. As the day wore on, I found myself studying the trees with new eyes. Up close, they were even more magnificent than I'd initially realized. The bark of the big fir was deeply furrowed, creating a landscape of ridges and valleys that harbored tiny ecosystems of moss and lichen. The cedar's bark hung in fibrous strips that moved like curtains in the slightest air current. Beautiful. Alien. Patient. They were waiting for something, I realized. This wasn't random movement or growth. It was purposeful, directed. They'd chosen me specifically, isolated me for reasons I couldn't understand. But what did trees want with a human being? Night fell like a curtain dropping. Without the artificial lights of civilization penetrating the forest, darkness here was absolute. I lit my emergency lantern and placed it on the dinette table, creating a small island of light in the pressing black. That's when I heard the whispering. It started as a sound that might have been wind through leaves, a soft susurrus that seemed to come from all directions at once. But gradually, I began to pick out patterns in the sound, rhythms and cadences that suggested language rather than random noise. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. I pressed my ear to the RV's wall and realized the sound was coming from the trees themselves, transmitted through wood and bark like voices through a telephone line. They were talking to each other, these ancient giants, sharing information in a language that predated human speech. And they were talking about me. I couldn't understand the words, if they were words at all, but I could hear my name woven through the sounds like a thread of familiarity in an alien tapestry. Emma. 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 Passed from tree to tree around the circle, each one adding its own harmonics and overtones until my name became a symphony. The whispering continued all night, rising and falling like a tide. Sometimes it seemed gentle, almost affectionate. Other times it carried undertones of hunger that made my blood freeze in my veins. I huddled in my bed with the covers pulled over my head, but the sound penetrated everything, vibrating through the RV's frame and into my bones. When morning came, the clearing had shrunk again. The trees were now so close to the RV that their lower branches scraped against the roof and sides whenever the wind moved them. Getting outside required ducking under cedar boughs that hung down like a beaded curtain. The space around the RV had contracted to maybe 10 feet in any direction, just enough room to walk around the vehicle if I bent low and squeezed between trunks. But that wasn't the most disturbing change. The trees had faces, not obvious ones, nothing so crude as carved features or googly eyes stuck to bark. But in the natural patterns of the wood grain, in the arrangement of knots and scars and lichen patches, I could see expressions looking back at me. A curve of bark that suggested a mouth, shadows that fell across the trunk just right to create the illusion of eyes, branches that hung down like hair-framing ancient, patient faces. They were watching me with the focused attention of scientists observing a specimen. I spent that day trying to squeeze through the gaps between trees, looking for any opening large enough to escape through. But even where the trunks were farthest apart, the space was too narrow for a human body. The branches interlaced overhead, creating a solid canopy that blocked out all but the faintest traces of daylight. I was in a cage made of living wood. That evening, I tried to build a fire in the old ring, desperate for the comfort of flames and light. But the moment I struck a match, every tree in the circle creaked simultaneously, a sound like a wooden ship in a storm. The branches above me rustled without any wind, and I felt the clear message: no fire, not in their space. I retreated to the RV as darkness fell, leaving the cold ashes undisturbed. The whispering started earlier that night, beginning before full darkness had set in, but this time I could understand fragments of it. Words in English mixed with sounds that had no human equivalent. Communication that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to some primitive part of my brain. Stay, they said. Join us. Grow deep. Put down roots. We have been alone so long, so very long. She is warm. She moves. She thinks quick thoughts like bird songs. Keep her. Teach her to be still. Teach her to listen. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices followed me inside my skull. They painted pictures in my mind, visions of myself seated at the base of the great fir, back against its bark, as roots slowly emerged from the earth to wrap around my ankles, my wrists, my throat. Gentle restraints that would hold me until I learned to be still, to think in the long, slow thoughts of trees. They showed me what I would become, a hybrid thing, part human and part forest, fed by sunlight and rain instead of food. My consciousness expanding to encompass the entire wood. I would live for centuries, they promised. Millennia. I would see the world change and grow old while I remained, patient and eternal, part of something vast and ancient and wise. All I had to do was stop fighting, stop trying to leave. Let them teach me how to be still. Stay, they whispered. Stay, Emma. Stay. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke to gray dawn light filtering through branches now so thick they blocked 90% of the sky. The clearing had contracted further overnight. The trees were pressed up against the RV on all sides, their bark scraping against the aluminum siding with every slight movement. When I tried to open the door, it hit the trunk of the big fir after moving only 6 inches. I was sealed inside. Panic hit me then, real and undeniable. I pushed against the door with all my strength, trying to force it open wider, but the tree on the other side was immovable as a mountain. I tried the emergency exit window, but branches pressed against it from outside, their twigs tapping against the glass like skeletal fingers. The RV had become a coffin. I spent hours testing every window, every vent, every possible exit. The trees had positioned themselves with mathematical precision, blocking every opening while leaving just enough space for air to circulate. They didn't want me to suffocate. They wanted me alive and conscious, aware of my captivity. As the day wore on, the reality of my situation settled over me like a weight. I was going to die here. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually my food and water would run out. The trees would wait. They had nothing but time. And when I was weak enough, hungry enough, desperate enough, they would make their final offer. Join us, or die. The whispering started again as evening fell. Gentler now, almost loving. The trees spoke to me like parents coaxing a frightened child, their voices full of patient affection. We know you are afraid. Fear is natural, but fear passes. We have watched you since you arrived. We know your sadness, your loneliness, your pain. We can take the pain away. We can give you peace. You will never be lonely again. We are many, and we will be one. They showed me more visions, memories of other humans who had found their way into this clearing over the decades. Loggers who had come to cut them down and had instead learned to worship. Hikers who had lost their way and found something better than any destination. Researchers who had come to study the forest and had become part of it instead. I saw them all, my predecessors, nestled among the roots of the great trees. Their bodies had merged with the wood over time, becoming part of the living network that connected every tree in the grove. They were still conscious, still aware, but their thoughts moved at the speed of seasons instead of seconds. They dreamed the slow dreams of mountains, felt the patient pulse of geological time. They were happy, the trees assured me, peaceful, complete. You can be like them, the voices whispered. You can be home. No, I said aloud, my voice harsh in the confined space of the RV. No, I won't stay. I won't join you. I'm getting out of here. The whispering stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard a new sound, a slow, rhythmic thumping from outside. Something large was striking the RV's exterior walls, hitting them with deliberate, measured blows. The impacts came from all sides, as if every tree in the circle was taking turns hitting the RV with its branches. The vehicle rocked slightly with each blow, and I heard the aluminum siding begin to buckle and dent. They were trying to break in. I grabbed my emergency axe from the supply cabinet and held it ready, though I knew how useless it would be against opponents like these. The thumping continued, growing faster and more aggressive. Branches scraped against the windows with sounds like claws on glass. The roof creaked and groaned under the weight of limbs pressing down from above. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the violence stopped. In the absolute silence that followed, I heard a voice that made my blood turn to ice water. It was my own voice, speaking from just outside the RV door. "Emma," my voice called. "Emma, are you in there? I'm hurt. I need help." The voice was perfect. My accent, my inflection, even the slight rasp I got when I was tired. If I hadn't known I was alone in here, I would have sworn I was listening to a recording of myself. "Please," my voice continued, sounding weak and frightened. "Something attacked me out here. I'm bleeding. I need you to let me in." I pressed my back against the far wall of the RV, axe clutched in trembling hands. The voice that sounded exactly like mine continued pleading for help, sometimes crying, sometimes whispering, sometimes screaming in terror as if something was dragging it away into the woods. The performance lasted for hours. My doppelganger voice cycled through every emotion, every tactic that might convince me to open the door. It claimed to be injured, lost, pursued by monsters. It begged and threatened and cajoled. It told me about family emergencies that required my immediate attention, about rescuers who were waiting just outside the clearing, about escape routes I had somehow missed. But I knew the truth. The trees had learned to mimic my voice, probably from listening to me talk on my phone or sing to myself while hiking. They were using my own words against me, trying to trick me into opening the door. As dawn broke, the false voice finally fell silent. But the damage was done. I'd spent the entire night listening to myself plead for help I couldn't give, to trust people who weren't people at all. It was a psychological warfare of the most intimate kind, and I felt my sanity fraying at the edges. The clearing was smaller again. The trees now pressed so tightly against the RV that I couldn't see daylight through any of the windows. The vehicle creaked and settled under the pressure of living wood that seemed to be slowly, gently crushing it. I rationed my remaining water and ate sparingly from my dwindling supplies. The trees could afford to wait. They'd been here for centuries and would be here for centuries more. But I was dying by degrees, wearing down one sip of water and one anxious heartbeat at a time. That's when I noticed the roots. They were coming up through the floor of the RV, thin, pale tendrils that emerged from cracks in the linoleum like searching fingers. As I watched in fascination and horror, they grew visibly, extending across the floor with purposeful movement. The trees were coming for me from below. I tried to cut the roots with my axe, but for every one I severed, 2 more appeared. They avoided the blade with uncanny intelligence, growing around obstacles and regrouping to continue their advance. Some were thin as hair, others thick as my wrist. All of them moved with the focused determination of predators stalking prey. By evening, the floor was covered with a network of roots that pulsed gently with some internal rhythm. They didn't attack me, not yet, but they followed my movements, turning to track me like the heads of snakes. waiting for the right moment to strike. I climbed onto the dinette table to get away from them, but roots began emerging from the walls as well, pushing through gaps around windows and vents. The RV was being invaded from all sides, transformed into an extension of the forest's root system. The whispering returned that night, but now it came from inside the RV as well as outside. The roots carried the tree's voices directly into my shelter, making the entire vehicle resonate like the soundboard of some enormous instrument. "You cannot run forever," they said. "You cannot fight what you are meant to become. Join us willingly, and we will be gentle. Resist, and we will take you anyway. You are already part of us. Can you not feel the roots calling to your blood?" And I could feel it, a strange tingling in my feet and hands, as if something in my circulatory system was responding to the presence of the roots. The longer I stayed in this place, the more connected I became to the forest's network. The trees weren't just trying to capture me. They were slowly converting me, changing my body chemistry to make me compatible with their ancient symbiosis. I had maybe hours before the transformation became irreversible. That's when I remembered the spare battery for my emergency radio. I'd brought it to charge my phone, but the radio itself had a small backup power source. If I could get a signal out, maybe someone would come looking for me. Maybe I could at least warn others to stay away from this place. I found the radio buried under camping gear and turned it to the emergency frequency. Static filled the RV, but underneath it I could hear fragments of human voices, distant, distorted, but unmistakably real. "Mayday, Mayday," I whispered into the microphone. "This is Emma Rodriguez, camping in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest near Iron Creek. I'm trapped and need immediate rescue." I gave my approximate coordinates and repeated the message several times before the battery died. Whether anyone had heard me, whether my position was clear enough for searchers to find, I had no way of knowing. But at least I'd tried. The roots seemed to sense my act of defiance. They surged across the floor toward my table, growing thicker and more aggressive. I swung my axe at the largest ones, severing them in showers of clear sap that smelled like pine and copper pennies. But for every root I cut, the severed ends grew back stronger. And now they were moving faster, climbing the table legs with muscular contractions like enormous earthworms. I jumped from the table to the driver's seat, then to the bed in the back of the RV, trying to stay ahead of their advance. Outside, I could hear the trees groaning and creaking as they pressed even closer to the vehicle. The walls began to buckle inward, and cracks appeared in the windows. The RV was being slowly crushed in a fist made of living wood. I was going to die here. The realization brought a strange kind of peace. I'd fought as hard as I could, survived as long as possible. But some battles couldn't be won through stubbornness and determination. Some predators were simply too large, too patient, too alien for human resistance to matter. I closed my eyes and tried to think about good things. My childhood dog, my first apartment, the way Mark used to make me laugh before everything went wrong. If I was going to become part of something ancient and strange, at least I could contribute whatever small brightness I'd managed to accumulate in my 32 years. The roots reached me then, wrapping around my ankles with surprising gentleness. They felt warm, almost loving, as they began to pull me down toward the floor. More roots emerged from the walls to embrace my arms, my waist, my throat. Instead of pain, I felt a deep relaxation spreading through my body, the tree's gift to ease my transition. "Sleep," they whispered. "Rest. We will take care of everything now." My vision blurred, and I felt my thoughts beginning to slow and spread like honey poured on a winter morning. The tree's consciousness touched mine, vast, patient, unutterably old. They showed me memories stretching back centuries. The first growth of seedlings in this spot, the slow dance of seasons, the gradual expansion of their collective awareness. I was becoming part of something that had survived ice ages and droughts, fires and floods. Something that would endure long after human civilization had crumbled to dust. There was comfort in that continuity, peace in joining something larger than my small, troubled life. But just as I was about to surrender completely, I heard the sound of chainsaws in the distance. The trees' grip on me loosened as their attention turned to this new threat. Through my fading consciousness, I felt their alarm, confusion, and anger at the approach of their ancient enemies. The whispering changed tone, becoming urgent, defensive. The chainsaw sounds grew closer, accompanied by human voices shouting coordinates and directions. Someone had heard my radio call. Someone was coming. The roots holding me began to withdraw, pulling back into the floor and walls as the trees concentrated on defending themselves. My vision cleared, and I felt my thoughts sharpen as the chemical haze of their influence lifted. Whatever they'd been doing to make me compliant, they'd stopped doing it. I could hear the rescue team cutting through the outer ring of trees, their chainsaws screaming as they bit into ancient wood. The trees around my RV groaned and swayed, their attention entirely focused on the attackers. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. But the trees weren't defenseless. I heard screams from outside, human voices filled with terror and confusion. The chainsaws fell silent one by one, replaced by sounds of crashing and heavy impacts. Whatever the trees were doing to fight back, it was working. The clearing fell quiet again, and I felt the trees' attention return to me. But something had changed. Their earlier patience was gone, replaced by urgency and anger. They'd been interrupted in their careful seduction, forced to defend themselves when they'd thought themselves perfectly hidden and safe. Now, they just wanted me gone. Roots erupted from every surface of the RV simultaneously. Not gentle this time, but aggressive, hungry. They wrapped around my limbs and began pulling in different directions, trying to dismember me rather than convert me. The trees' whispers became screams of rage and frustration. I fought back with everything I had, swinging my axe in wild arcs that sent sap spraying across the cramped interior. But there were too many roots, coming from too many directions. They pulled me to the floor and began dragging me toward a crack that had opened in the RV's side, a mouth lined with splinters that led directly into the heartwood of the great fir. That's when the wall exploded inward. A chainsaw blade punched through the aluminum siding like it was paper, followed by the head and shoulders of a Forest Service ranger in a hard hat and reflective vest. He took in the scene with professional calm. Me, covered in roots and sap. The interior of the RV transformed into something from a nightmare, and simply went to work. "Close your eyes," he shouted over the roar of his saw, and began cutting me free. The roots writhed and fought back, but they couldn't match the speed of steel teeth moving at thousands of RPM. In seconds, I was free of their grip. The ranger hauled me toward the hole he'd cut in the wall while his chainsaw continued to scream its mechanical defiance at the organic horror around us. "Go, go, go!" he yelled, pushing me through the opening. I tumbled out into gray morning light and found myself in the middle of a war zone. Half a dozen Forest Service personnel were positioned around the clearing, chainsaws and axes working methodically to cut through the ring of trees. They moved with practiced efficiency, like a SWAT team trained for this exact scenario. But the trees were fighting back in ways that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Branches whipped through the air like tentacles, trying to grab the rescuers. Roots erupted from the ground to trip them or wrap around their ankles. The air filled with flying splinters and chunks of bark as the ancient giants thrashed in fury. "This way." A woman in Forest Service gear grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a gap in the tree line that her team had managed to cut. Behind us, I could hear the RV being crushed completely as the trees closed ranks, compacting it into twisted metal and shattered fiberglass. We ran through a tunnel of severed branches and smoking stumps, the rescue team maintaining a corridor of escape with their roaring saws. The trees pressed in from both sides, trying to close the gap, but the rangers worked with desperate efficiency to keep the path clear. "Keep moving," someone shouted. "They're regrouping." I stumbled over roots and debris, my legs weak from days of captivity and terror. Behind us, the forest erupted in a sound like nothing I'd ever heard. The screams of wounded trees mixed with something that might have been voices, all blending into a cacophony of rage and loss. We reached the Forest Service trucks parked on the main road, just as the trees made their final assault. I looked back to see the clearing disappearing completely. the giants flowing together like water to seal the gap where the rescue tunnel had been. In seconds, there was no sign that an opening had ever existed. The ranger who had cut me free, his name tag read Peterson, helped me into the back of an ambulance that was waiting with the convoy. "Ma'am, we need to get you to a hospital," he said, but I grabbed his arm. "How did you know?" I gasped. "How did you know to come?" He looked uncomfortable, glancing at his colleagues before answering. "We've had reports from this area before. Your radio call was just the first one we've been able to triangulate quickly enough to attempt a rescue. Reports. Missing campers. RVs found empty, sometimes crushed. We've lost 3 rescue teams over the years trying to investigate." He paused, studying my face. "You're the first person we've managed to bring out alive." The ambulance doors closed, and I felt the vehicle start moving away from the forest. Through the rear window, I watched the trees recede into the distance, their canopy innocent and still in the morning light. To anyone driving past, it would look like normal old-growth forest. Beautiful, peaceful, safe. But I knew better. The paramedic in the ambulance checked my vitals and asked questions I barely heard. My mind was still processing what Peterson had said. Other campers, other disappearances, other rescue teams lost. How long had the trees been hunting? How many people had vanished into that hungry grove? At the hospital, doctors found traces of unknown organic compounds in my bloodstream, plant alkaloids that didn't match any known species. The compounds were slowly metabolizing out of my system, but for the first few days, I experienced vivid dreams of root networks and underground communication, as if part of the forest's consciousness was still connected to mine. I gave my statement to the authorities, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Moving trees, talking roots. It sounded like the ravings of someone who'd had a psychotic break in the wilderness. The physical evidence supported trauma and dehydration, but nothing more exotic than that. The official report blamed gas leaks from my RV's propane system for hallucinations, combined with stress-induced paranoia. The crushed vehicle was attributed to unstable soil and old-growth trees shifting due to recent rainfall. Case closed. But Peterson visited me before I was discharged. "Off the record," he said, sitting beside my hospital bed, "we've been tracking anomalous incidents in that section of forest for over 20 years. The trees in that particular grove are older than anything else in the area. Some of them might be over 1,000 years old. You believe me?" He nodded slowly. "We've cordoned off the area, marked it as unstable ground. But trees that old, they have ways of moving the barriers when they want to. New campers find their way in every few months. Why don't you cut them down?" Peterson's expression grew troubled. "We tried once, sent in a full crew with heavy equipment. Half the team never came out, and the survivors—" He shook his head. "They weren't the same. Started talking about hearing voices in any forest they entered, about needing to go back. 3 of them disappeared from the psychiatric ward. Security footage showed them walking out on their own. But they moved wrong. Too still. Too patient." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying those trees have been there since before humans walked this continent. They've learned to adapt, to survive, and they're not done hunting." I was released 2 days later with prescriptions for anxiety medication and a recommendation for therapy. My insurance company cut me a check for the destroyed RV, and I used part of the money to move to Phoenix, as far from old-growth forests as I could manage. But Peterson was right about one thing. Even now, 3 months later, I can hear them sometimes. When I'm alone at night, when the city gets quiet enough, I hear whispering that might be wind through leaves or might be something else entirely. I dream of root networks spreading beneath Phoenix's streets, of ancient consciousness testing the boundaries of concrete and steel. Sometimes I wake up with dirt under my fingernails, though I haven't been near soil in weeks. Sometimes I catch myself walking too slowly, too deliberately, as if I'm trying to conserve energy for a journey measured in centuries rather than minutes. Sometimes I look at the potted plants in my apartment and wonder if they're looking back. The worst part is the longing. Despite everything they did to me, Despite the terror and captivity and near-death experience, part of me misses the connection I felt in those final moments before the rescue. The sense of belonging to something vast and patient and eternal. The peace of thinking in geological time instead of racing human thoughts. I've started avoiding the outdoors altogether. No camping, no hiking, no picnics in parks. I tell myself it's trauma, a reasonable response to what I experienced. But deep down, I know the truth. I'm not avoiding the forest because I'm afraid of it. I'm avoiding it because I'm afraid of how much I want to go back. Last week, I found myself researching land for sale in rural areas, places where old trees grow undisturbed. I caught myself before I made any calls, deleted the browser history, threw out the printed listings, but the urge is getting stronger. The trees changed me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. They planted something in my bloodstream, in my dreams, in the deep places of my mind that govern instinct and desire. A seed of belonging that grows a little larger every day. I know I should leave the city, move somewhere even more urban, surrounded by steel and glass and the comfortable noise of human civilization. But I also know it wouldn't matter. Distance is meaningless to things that think in centuries and communicate through root networks that span entire continents. They're waiting for me, patient as mountains, certain as tides. And sooner or later, I'm going to stop running and go home. I can feel it in my bones, in the slow pulse of sap rising through wood, in the deep earth rhythm that beats beneath the frantic scramble of human time. The forest is calling, and every day it gets a little harder to resist. Peterson gave me his card before I left the hospital. "If you ever feel compelled to go back," he said, "call me first. We'll try to talk you out of it." But we both knew talking wouldn't be enough. Not when the call came from something older than words, deeper than reason. I keep the card in my wallet, next to my driver's license and credit cards. A talisman against the growing certainty that this story isn't over, that it's just beginning. Because the trees don't just move through forest paths and clearings. They move through dreams and bloodstreams and the vast underground networks that connect every living thing on Earth. They're in me now, part of me, growing stronger with each passing season. And when I'm ready, when the human part of me finally quiets down enough to hear what they're really saying, I'll drive back to Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. I'll find that access road near Iron Creek, follow it deeper than any map shows, until I reach the clearing that rearranges itself to catch the lonely and the lost. The trees will be waiting, patient as stone, older than memory. And this time, I won't fight the roots when they rise to meet me. This time, I'll let them teach me how to be still. Story 2. My name is Marcus. I'm 34. The fog at Osage Hills State Park in Oklahoma had fingerprints. I came here with my girlfriend Sarah and our dog Rex, a golden retriever who usually never shut up, seeking a quiet weekend away from the city. The park stretched across rolling hills covered in post oak and blackjack, with deep ravines carved by ancient creeks. We'd rented a small Class C RV, nothing fancy, just enough space for 2 people and a dog who thought he owned the place. The first night passed without incident. We'd parked at a secluded site near the edge of Lookout Mountain, far enough from other campers that Rex could run free without bothering anyone. Sarah made dinner on the little propane stove while I set up our camp chairs outside. The autumn air carried the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves, peaceful in that way that makes city folks like us remember why we pay taxes for places like this. But when I woke up the second morning, something felt wrong. The fog had rolled in thick overnight, so dense I couldn't see our picnic table 10 feet away. That wasn't unusual for October in Oklahoma, but this fog felt different, heavy, oppressive, like it was pressing down on us with intent. I stepped outside in my underwear to let Rex out, and that's when I first noticed them. Handprints, oily, dark impressions smeared across the RV's windshield, the side mirror, the door handle, perfect human handprints, fingers spread wide, as if someone had been feeling their way around our vehicle in the dark. "Sarah," I called softly, not wanting to alarm her. "Come look at this." She emerged wearing my oversized flannel shirt, her long brown hair messy with sleep. Sarah had always been the practical one between us, the one who found logical explanations for everything. She took one look at the handprints and frowned. "Condensation, probably," she said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. Maybe the fog interacted with some residue on the glass. I ran my finger along one of the prints on the windshield. The mark was sticky, leaving an oily residue on my skin that smelled faintly of copper and something else, something organic and wrong. The fog seemed to thicken around my hand as I touched it, clinging to my fingers like wet cotton. "This isn't condensation," I said. "Look at the size of these hands. They're huge." Sarah came closer, squinting through the gray morning light. The handprints were indeed massive, easily twice the size of my own hands, with fingers so long they seemed almost inhuman. But it was the thumbs that made my skin crawl. They were on the wrong side, as if the hands had been reversed or belonged to someone whose anatomy didn't quite match human norms. Rex whined from inside the RV, pressing his nose against the screen door but refusing to come out. That should have been our first real warning. Rex feared nothing. Not thunderstorms, not other dogs, not even the vacuum cleaner. But he wouldn't set foot outside that morning. "We should clean this off," Sarah said, grabbing paper towels from inside. But as she wiped at the prints, the fog around her hands grew thicker, more substantial. It wasn't just clinging anymore. It was actively wrapping around her wrists like translucent rope. "Sarah, stop." I grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the RV. Where the fog had touched her skin, it left those same oily handprints, perfect impressions of fingers that had never actually touched her. We stood there in the swirling gray, staring at each other with growing unease. The forest around us had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through the leaves. Just the soft whisper of fog moving through the trees like breath. "We should go," Sarah whispered. I nodded, but when I tried to start the RV, nothing happened. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. The battery was fine, the gas tank full, but it was like the fog itself was choking the life out of the motor. "Pop the hood," Sarah said. She'd grown up on a farm and knew her way around engines better than I did. But when I pulled the hood release, the latch was slick with that same oily residue. The fog immediately poured into the engine compartment like it was being sucked in by a vacuum. Sarah peered into the gray mass that had swallowed our engine. "I can't see anything, it's too thick." I grabbed a flashlight from the emergency kit, but the beam barely penetrated a foot into the fog before being absorbed completely. It was like trying to illuminate a wall of wet cement. "Let's just wait it out," I said, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. Fog like this usually burns off by noon. But it didn't burn off. If anything, it grew thicker as the day progressed. By afternoon, we couldn't see more than arm's length in any direction. The fog had become so dense it was almost solid, pressing against the RV's windows with a weight that made the whole vehicle creak. And the handprints kept multiplying. They appeared on every surface the fog touched. The picnic table, the fire ring, the trees around our campsite. Always the same impossible size, always with those reversed thumbs. Sometimes I'd turn around and find fresh prints on a surface I'd just cleaned, as if invisible giants were constantly touching everything around us. Sarah had grown quieter as the day wore on, sitting at the tiny dinette table and staring out at the gray, nothing beyond the windows. Rex refused to leave his spot under the bed, whining softly whenever one of us moved toward the door. "Do you think it's some kind of weather phenomenon?" Sarah asked as evening approached. "Like, maybe the humidity is causing some kind of optical illusion?" I wanted to agree with her, to find some rational explanation for what we were experiencing. But rational explanations don't leave oily residue on your skin. They don't make dogs cower in terror or cause engines to fail for no reason. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I don't think we should go outside after dark." As if summoned by my words, night began to fall, or what passed for night in that suffocating gray world. The fog didn't lift. It simply grew darker, taking on an almost purple hue that made it look even more unnatural. That's when we started hearing the breathing. It began as a soft whisper, barely audible above the RV's ventilation fan. But as the darkness deepened, the sound grew more distinct. deep, rhythmic inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fog itself was breathing, expanding and contracting like the chest of some massive sleeping beast. Sarah grabbed my hand across the table. Her palm was cold and slightly damp, though whether from fear or the oppressive humidity, I couldn't tell. "Marcus," she whispered, "look at the windows." I turned to follow her gaze and felt my blood freeze. The fog outside wasn't just moving randomly anymore. It was forming shapes. Vague at first, but becoming more defined by the minute. Human shapes. Dozens of them, pressing against the glass from the outside. But these weren't quite human. They were too tall, too thin, with proportions that hurt to look at directly. Their heads were elongated, tilted at angles that would have broken a person's neck. And their hands, those massive wrong-way hands, were pressed flat against every window, leaving print after print after print. "Don't look at them directly," I said, though I couldn't tear my own eyes away. "Something's wrong with the way they move." The shapes in the fog didn't walk so much as flow, their forms rippling like water as they circled the RV. Sometimes they'd stretch impossibly tall, their heads disappearing into the gray above. Other times they'd compress into squat, toad-like forms that scuttled along the ground on all fours. Rex had started barking from under the bed, sharp, panicked barks that spoke of pure animal terror. But the sound seemed muffled, as if the fog was absorbing it before it could properly reach our ears. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "How? The engine won't start, and we can't see 2 feet in any direction. Then we wait for morning." But I was beginning to suspect that morning might not come. The darkness felt too permanent, too alive. It wasn't the natural darkness of night, but something deeper, more fundamental, the kind of darkness that existed before light was invented. Around midnight, or what I estimated was midnight since my watch had stopped working, the fog began to seep into the RV. It started as thin wisps creeping in around the door seals and window frames. But within minutes, those wisps had become tendrils, then streams, then a steady flow of gray that pooled on the floor like liquid smoke. "Close the vents!" Sarah shouted, jumping up to crank shut the roof ventilators, but the fog kept coming, finding cracks and gaps I hadn't even known existed. It rose from the floor like floodwater, swirling around our ankles, then our knees. And everywhere it touched, it left handprints. They appeared on our clothes, our skin, the furniture, perfect impressions of those massive, wrong-way hands, but now I could feel them forming, could sense invisible fingers pressing against my body as the fog caressed me with its oily touch. "The bedroom," I gasped, pulling Sarah toward the back of the RV. "Maybe we can seal ourselves in." We stumbled through the rising fog, Rex right behind us, whimpering and pressing against our legs. The bedroom was smaller, with fewer openings for the fog to exploit. I slammed the door and immediately began stuffing towels under the gap, but it was useless. The gray tendrils were already seeping through the walls themselves, as if the fog had become so dense it could penetrate solid matter. Sarah sat on the bed, pulling Rex into her lap. The dog was shaking so hard I could hear his teeth chattering. In the dim light from my phone's flashlight, I could see handprints appearing on the bedroom walls. Not just the oily impressions, but actual indentations, as if massive hands were pressing into the paneling from the inside. "Marcus!" Sarah's voice was strange, distant. "I think I remember this place." "What do you mean?" "Not the campground. This situation. I've dreamed about it. The fog, the hands, the breathing. I've been dreaming about it for weeks." I stared at her in the pale glow of the phone light. Her face looked different. Not quite wrong, but subtly altered, as if the fog was changing her features in tiny, almost imperceptible ways. "Sarah, that's not possible, isn't it?" She smiled, and for a moment her teeth looked too sharp. "Maybe this has happened before. Maybe it happens all the time, and people just forget." The fog around her feet was swirling faster now, almost eager, and I realized with growing horror that Rex wasn't shaking from fear anymore. He was shaking from cold, the kind of bone-deep cold that comes from being touched by something that has never been warm. "Sarah," step away from the fog. Why? It feels nice, cool, like getting into a swimming pool on a hot day. Her voice was becoming dreamy, distant. And the hands are so gentle. They're just trying to say hello. She held up her arm, and I saw handprints covering her skin from wrist to shoulder. Not the oily impressions we'd seen before, but actual pale marks, as if the fog had somehow bleached her skin in the perfect shape of those massive hands. Sarah, listen to me. Whatever this is, it's not natural. We need to fight it. But she was already standing, walking toward the bedroom door. Her movements were strange, too fluid, as if her joints had been replaced with something more flexible. Rex jumped off the bed and ran to the far corner, pressing himself against the wall and whimpering. "I need to go outside," Sarah said. "They're waiting for me." "No." I grabbed her arm, but my hand passed through her like she was made of mist. She turned to look at me, and her eyes had become completely white. Not with blindness, but with fog. Thick, swirling fog where her pupils and iris should have been. "Don't you want to see what they look like?" she asked. "Really look like? Not just the shapes in the fog, but their true forms." I tried to speak, but the fog had grown so thick in the bedroom that breathing had become difficult. Each inhalation felt like drowning in reverse, my lungs filling with gray, nothing that tasted of copper and decay. Sarah opened the bedroom door and walked out into the main area of the RV. I followed, though every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden. The fog inside the RV had become so dense it was almost solid, but I could see shapes moving within it. Tall, impossible shapes with too many joints and hands that reached in directions that defied geometry. Sarah walked straight to the RV's door and opened it. The fog outside poured in like a gray tsunami, bringing with it a sound that wasn't quite breathing anymore. It was more like singing, a low, harmonious hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. And in that sound, I could hear voices, human voices, speaking in languages I'd never heard but somehow understood. They were calling our names. Not just our names, but every name we'd ever been called. Childhood nicknames, embarrassing pet names from old relationships, the name my mother had considered before settling on Marcus. They knew us completely, intimately, in ways that no living thing should. Sarah stepped outside, and I watched in horror as her body began to change. Her limbs stretched, becoming longer and thinner. Her head tilted at that impossible angle I'd seen in the fog shapes outside. And her hands. Her hands grew larger, the thumbs sliding around to the wrong side. She turned back to look at me, and her face was still recognizably Sarah, but stretched and wrong, like a photograph that had been pulled out of shape. "It's beautiful out here," she said, her voice echoing from multiple directions at once. "You can see everything. All the times this has happened before. All the people who've joined us. We're not alone, Marcus. We're never alone." The fog around her was so thick now that she was more suggestion than substance, a Sarah-shaped hole in the gray. But I could see others moving beyond her, dozens of elongated figures dancing in the mist, their massive hands leaving prints on everything they touched. Rex bolted past me and out the door, disappearing into the fog with a terrified howl that cut off abruptly. I called after him, but the gray swallowed my voice like it had swallowed everything else. "Come outside," Sarah sang from somewhere in the mist. "Let them touch you properly. Let them show you what you really are." I backed away from the door, but there was nowhere to go. The fog had filled every inch of the RV, and now I could feel those massive hands pressing against me from all sides. Gentle but insistent, leaving their oily prints on my clothes, my skin, my very soul. But something in me refused to give in. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was the last flicker of whatever makes us human. I fought my way toward the driver's seat, gasping in the thick air, my vision blurring from lack of oxygen. The keys were still in the ignition. I turned them, expecting nothing, but the engine coughed to life. For just a moment, the fog in the cab thinned, as if the sound had disrupted whatever held it together. I threw the RV into drive and hit the gas. The vehicle lurched forward into the gray nothing, branches scraping against the roof as I drove blind through the forest. I couldn't see where I was going, couldn't even tell if I was still on the road, but I kept driving. The fog tried to thicken around the windshield, tried to force its way through the vents, but the movement seemed to disrupt it somehow. Behind me, I could hear Sarah calling, her voice growing fainter but never quite disappearing. "Marcus, come back. We're waiting for you. We'll always be waiting." I drove for what felt like hours, the fog gradually thinning as I put distance between myself and whatever had taken over our campsite. When I finally saw the lights of the ranger station through the gray, I nearly wept with relief. The ranger on duty was a middle-aged woman named Helen, who looked at me with the kind of professional concern reserved for people having mental breakdowns in public. I tried to explain what had happened: the fog, the handprints, Sarah's transformation. But even to my own ears it sounded like the ravings of someone who'd been breathing too much propane. "Son, you've got some kind of gas leak in that RV," Helen said after listening to my story. "Carbon monoxide, most likely. Makes people hallucinate, see things that aren't there. You're lucky you got out when you did." She called for an ambulance to check me out, and while we waited, I walked around the RV looking for evidence of what I'd experienced. The handprints were gone. The oily residue had vanished. Even the fog was lifting, revealing a perfectly normal October morning in Oklahoma. But Sarah was gone, really gone. Not transformed, not taken by monsters in the mist, just gone. Her clothes were still in the RV, her purse, her phone. Rex was gone too, though his leash remained clipped to the table leg where I'd left it the first night. The official report said they'd probably wandered off during the night and gotten lost in the fog. Search teams combed the area for days but found no trace of either of them. The authorities suggested that Sarah might have been affected by the same gas leak that had caused my hallucinations, leading to confusion and disorientation. Everyone had a rational explanation. The fog was unusual but not unprecedented for that time of year. The handprints I'd seen were probably just my imagination, enhanced by carbon monoxide poisoning. Sarah and Rex had most likely fallen into one of the deep ravines that carved through the area, their bodies hidden by the dense underbrush. I wanted to believe them. God, how I wanted to believe them. But sometimes, on foggy mornings, I wake up to find handprints on my bedroom windows. Massive prints with thumbs on the wrong side, pressed against the glass from the outside of my third-story apartment. And in the fog that clings to my car after rain, I can sometimes see shapes moving. Tall, wrong shapes that call my name in Sarah's voice. The mist leaves oily handprints on everything it touches, and sometimes when the fog is thick enough I can hear them singing. Waiting. Patient as only things that exist outside of time can be patient. I moved away from Oklahoma, but it doesn't matter. The fog finds me wherever I go. And every time it comes, the handprints get a little clearer, a little more solid. One day, I know I'll open my door and Sarah will be standing there, stretched and wrong, but still somehow Sarah, reaching out with hands that are too big and turned the wrong way. "It's beautiful out here," she'll say. "You can see everything." And despite everything I know, everything I've lost, I think I'll take her hand and step outside, because the fog is patient, but I'm only human, and humans, eventually, always give in to the thing that's been calling their name in the dark. The handprints are getting closer every night. Soon, I won't have to wonder anymore. Soon, I'll know what Sarah saw in that gray world between worlds, what made her smile as her body stretched into impossible shapes. Soon, the mist will touch me properly, and I'll understand why it leaves fingerprints on everything it caresses, why it breathes, why it sings our names in voices we've lost. Soon. The fog is coming tonight. I can smell it on the wind. That copper and decay scent that means they're getting closer. I've stopped closing my curtains. There's no point anymore. The handprints always find me. When they do, I hope I have the courage to go quietly. I hope I don't scream like Rex did in those final moments before the gray swallowed his voice forever. I hope Sarah is still in there somewhere, waiting for me with those two big hands and that wrong-way smile. The mist leaves oily handprints on everything it touches, including souls, it seems, including mine. Story 3. My name is Sarah. I'm 32, and the silence at Malheur National Forest didn't wait. It hunted. I should have known something was wrong when the GPS started glitching 50 miles out from Burns, Oregon. The screen flickered between satellite view and some kind of topographical nightmare that showed ridges where there should have been valleys, lakes where the map insisted on solid ground. My husband, Jake, laughed it off, tapping the dashboard of our rented Winnebago with the confidence of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't fix with enough determination and a Swiss Army knife. "Technology," he said, shaking his head as he guided us down Highway 205. "Give me a paper map any day." But we didn't have a paper map. We had our phones, which had lost a signal an hour ago, and we had the GPS unit that was now displaying what looked like a child's crayon drawing of impossible geography. The forest stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, a wall of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs that seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of green shadow that swallowed our headlights. There, Jake pointed to a barely visible dirt road branching off to the right. "That's got to be the turnoff for Crystal Creek Campground." I checked the reservation confirmation on my phone one more time before the screen went dark. Dead battery, though I could have sworn it had been at 60% when we'd stopped for gas and burns. "Are you sure? The road looks pretty rough." "Come on, Sarah. A little adventure never hurt anyone." Adventure. That's what Jake called everything that made me nervous. The rock climbing trips where he'd dangle from cliffs while I held my breath below. The whitewater rafting expeditions where the guides' safety briefings lasted longer than most college lectures. The camping trips to places so remote that cell towers were just a fond memory. This was supposed to be different. A peaceful long weekend in the RV, just the two of us, somewhere quiet enough to hear ourselves think. I'd been working 70-hour weeks at the firm, handling a merger that made grown men weep into their coffee. Jake had been pulling double shifts at the hospital, coming home with that hollow-eyed look that emergency room nurses get when they've seen too much. We needed this. We needed quiet. The dirt road immediately proved Jake wrong about adventure being harmless. The RV lurched and groaned as we navigated ruts deep enough to swallow a small car. Tree branches scraped against the sides with fingernail-on-chalkboard persistence. I watched the side mirror as clouds of dust billowed behind us, erasing any trace of the main road. "How far did the confirmation say?" Jake asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. 3 miles. I squinted through the windshield at the odometer. We'd already gone 5. Maybe the road curves more than we thought. But the road didn't curve. It continued straight as an arrow, cutting through forest so dense that the temperature inside the RV dropped 10 degrees. The shadows between the trees weren't the normal dappled patches you'd expect in late afternoon. They were solid black, impenetrable, like holes cut out of the world. That's when we heard it. Or rather, that's when we realized we couldn't hear it. "Stop the RV," I said. Jake glanced at me. "What?" "Just stop. Pull over." He eased the Winnebago to the side of the road, which wasn't much of a distinction since the road was barely wider than our vehicle anyway. The engine ticked as it cooled, and then nothing. Complete silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest evening. Not the gentle hush of wind through pine needles or the distant calls of settling birds. This was an absence of sound so profound it felt like being underwater. Even our breathing seemed muffled, absorbed by the air itself. "Okay, that's weird," Jake admitted. He tried the radio, but it produced only static. "Maybe there's a storm coming? Sometimes animals go quiet before—" A branch snapped somewhere to our left. Not the gentle crack of a twig underfoot, but the sharp report of something substantial breaking under weight. We both turned toward the sound, but the forest wall revealed nothing. "Probably just a deer," Jake said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Another snap, closer this time. Then another, from the opposite side of the road. Whatever was moving out there was big, and there was more than one of them. "Let's keep going," I said. "Find the campground." Jake nodded and started the engine. The sound was jarring after the supernatural quiet, but I welcomed it. As we rolled forward, I kept my eyes on the trees, looking for movement. The snapping sounds continued, paralleling our path but staying just out of sight. It felt like being escorted by something that didn't want to be seen. The road ended abruptly at a small clearing that might generously be called a campground. There was a fire ring made of stacked stones, a picnic table that had seen better decades, and a weathered wooden sign that read Crystal Creek Campground, established 1987. But no creek, no other campers, no facilities of any kind. This can't be right, I said, checking my phone again. Still dead. Jake parked the RV and stepped outside. I watched him walk the perimeter of the clearing, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The snapping sounds had stopped the moment we'd entered the clearing, but somehow that felt worse. It meant whatever had been following us was now watching. "There's supposed to be a creek," Jake called out, "and bathrooms and a camp host." I joined him outside and immediately regretted it. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water pressure. Even our conversation seemed to die just inches from our mouths, as if the air itself was swallowing sound. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," I suggested. "Let's go back to the main road and look at this." Jake was crouched beside the fire ring, pointing at something in the ashes. "Someone's been here recently." I walked over and saw what had caught his attention. In the center of the cold ashes sat a small pile of what looked like bones. Tiny ones, like from a bird or squirrel. They were arranged in a perfect circle and they were clean, picked completely bare. "Kids," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. "You know how kids are with gross stuff?" I knelt beside him and examined the bones more closely. They weren't scattered randomly like the remains of a meal. They were positioned deliberately, each one pointing toward the center of the circle where a single larger bone stood upright. A femur, probably from a rabbit. "Jake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we should go." He stood and brushed the ash from his hands. "Look, I know this place is a little creepy, but we drove 3 hours to get here. The reservation is non-refundable. One night, and we'll head back in the morning." That's when we heard the humming. It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing, more of a vibration felt in the chest than an actual sound. Then it grew, rising and falling in a melody that was almost familiar but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It seemed to come from every direction at once, emerging from the forest like smoke. Jake and I stood frozen beside the fire ring, our eyes scanning the tree line. The humming continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. "Okay," Jake said finally. That was definitely not kids, but we stayed. We leveled the RV, connected the hookups that didn't exist, and pretended this was normal. Jake insisted on building a fire using the wood we'd brought from home since there wasn't any deadfall in the clearing. I noticed that too, a forest with no fallen branches, no dead trees, no natural debris of any kind. It was as if the place had been swept clean. The fire caught quickly, too quickly. The flames leaped higher than they should have, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. I sat in my camping chair and watched those shadows, trying to convince myself they were just tricks of the flickering firelight. "You know what we need," Jake said, opening the cooler. "Beer. Everything's better with beer." He handed me a bottle and I took it gratefully. The familiar ritual of opening it, taking that first cold sip, helped ground me in reality. We were just 2 people camping in the woods. People had been camping in woods for thousands of years. There was nothing inherently threatening about trees and silence, and the humming started again. This time it was definitely closer and definitely not random. The melody had structure, repetition, intent. It sounded like a lullaby, but one I'd never heard before. Jake set down his beer and stood up, turning slowly to try to pinpoint the source. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" The humming stopped, but this time something answered. "Hello?" came a voice from the darkness beyond the firelight. It was small, high-pitched, a child's voice. "Are you lost?" Jake and I looked at each other. Neither of us had heard a vehicle approach. There had been no footsteps, no movement through the underbrush. The voice simply materialized from the black wall of forest. "We're camping," Jake said, projecting his voice toward where the sound had come from. "Are you okay out there? Do you need help?" A giggle drifted back, sweet and innocent. "I'm not lost. I live here." "Where are your parents?" I asked, standing up beside Jake. "They're coming," the voice replied. "They'll be here soon." I strained my eyes trying to see into the forest, but the darkness beyond our firelight was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was like looking into a physical barrier, something that actively consumed illumination. "You should come out where we can see you," Jake said. "It's not safe to be wandering around in the dark." Another giggle. "It's safe for me. I know all the paths." "What's your name?" I asked. "Emma," the voice said. "What's yours?" Jake started to answer, but I grabbed his arm. Something about this felt wrong. The voice was too clear, too distinct for someone standing in thick forest. It had no echo, no distortion from distance or obstacles. It sounded like the speaker was standing right next to us. "Don't," I whispered to Jake. He frowned at me but stayed quiet. "Hello?" the voice called again. I asked what your names are. "We should go inside," I murmured, edging toward the RV. "Sarah, it's a kid," Jake said, but he lowered his voice. "We can't just—" "I can hear you whispering," Emma said, and now there was a different quality to her voice. Still high and childish, but with an undertone that made my skin crawl. "That's not very polite." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but I pulled him toward the RV. "Inside. Now." We retreated to the Winnebago and closed the door behind us. Through the windows I could see our campfire still burning, casting its restless light across the empty clearing. No sign of a child anywhere. "You want to explain what that was about?" Jake asked. I pulled the curtains closed. "Something's not right about this place. It's a kid, Sarah, lost in the woods. We should help her." "Did you hear her voice? It didn't sound natural." Jake stared at me. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before I could answer, there was a knock on the RV door. 3 soft taps, perfectly spaced. "Hello?" Emma's voice called from just outside. "Can I come in? I'm cold." Jake moved toward the door, but I blocked his path. Through the thin aluminum wall, the voice continued. "I saw your light and thought you might have cocoa. My mommy used to make cocoa when I was cold." "Where is your mommy now?" Jake called out. "She's sleeping," Emma replied. "Under the trees. She's been sleeping for a long time." I felt ice form in my stomach. Jake's face had gone pale. "Emma," I said carefully, "how long have you been out here?" "Since the accident," she said. "Daddy was driving too fast on the old road. We hit a tree. Mommy and Daddy went to sleep, but I stayed awake. I've been waiting for someone to find me." Jake reached for the door handle. "Jesus, Sarah, if she's been out here since—" "No." I grabbed his wrist. "Listen to her voice." He paused, tilting his head. Emma was still talking outside, her voice bright and conversational. "I get lonely sometimes, but the trees keep me company. They whisper stories about all the people who've come here. They tell me about the families and the hikers and the couples like you. They remember everyone." "She's not breathing," I whispered to Jake. He looked at me blankly. "What?" "Listen, she's been talking for 2 minutes straight without taking a breath." We stood motionless, straining to hear. Emma's voice continued its cheerful monologue about the forest and the stories the trees told and how much she missed her parents, but there were no pauses, no intake of breath, no natural rhythm of human speech. "The trees told me you'd come," she said. "They said you'd be the ones to stay and play with me. They said you wouldn't leave like the others." "Others?" Jake called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Oh yes," Emma said, and I could hear her moving around the RV, circling it. Her footsteps made no sound, but her voice shifted position as she walked. "Lots of others. The man with the camera who came to take pictures. The family with 2 little boys. The old couple in the truck camper. They all stayed to play." I backed away from the door, pulling Jake with me. Emma's voice was now coming from the rear of the RV. "They're still here, you know, under the trees, sleeping like Mommy and Daddy. The trees take good care of them. They keep them safe and quiet." Jake's face had gone ashen. "We need to get out of here." I nodded, but before we could move, Emma spoke again. This time her voice came from directly above us as if she were standing on the roof. "You can't leave yet," she said, and all the childish sweetness had drained from her tone. "We haven't played any games." The RV began to rock gently, as if something large was moving around on top of it, but there was still no sound of footsteps, no creak of metal under weight. Just the sensation of movement. "The trees want to meet you." Emma continued. "They've been so patient, waiting for new friends. They don't like it when people try to leave before the games are finished." Jake grabbed the keys from the counter. "I'm starting the engine." But when he turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't turn over, didn't even click. The dashboard lights flickered once and died. "That's not very sporting," Emma said, her voice now somehow inside the RV with us. "The games haven't even started yet." I spun around, searching for the source of her voice, but we were alone in the confined space. The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves. "First game," Emma announced. "Hide and seek. You hide, and I'll seek. But here's the twist. If I find you, you have to stay and play forever. Just like the others." The rocking stopped. The voice fell silent. Even our own breathing seemed to fade until we were trapped in that suffocating quiet that had first welcomed us to this place. Jake tried the engine again. Nothing. "The radio," I whispered. "Try to call for help." But the radio was as dead as everything else. No static, no feedback, no sign of electronic life. "Maybe if we wait until morning," Jake said, but his voice carried no conviction. That's when we heard the scratching. It started at the rear of the RV, a soft, scraping sound like fingernails on metal. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic, something was drawing patterns on the aluminum skin of our shelter. I moved to the rear window and carefully pulled back the curtain. In the dim reflection of our interior lights, I could see marks appearing on the outside of the RV, symbols scratched into the metal by invisible hands. They looked almost like letters, but in no alphabet I recognized. "Jake," I breathed, but he was already beside me, staring at the marks. "What is that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the scratching moved to the side windows. More symbols appeared, carved deep enough to scrape through the paint. They formed patterns that hurt to look at, shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves in impossible ways. "Emma!" Jake called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Emma, stop this. You're scaring us." The scratching paused. Then Emma's giggle drifted through the walls, but it was different now. Deeper. Wrong. "Scared is good," she said. "Scared makes the game more fun." The scratching resumed. Faster now, more urgent. The symbols multiplied across every surface we could see, covering the RV in a writhing mass of incomprehensible script. Through it all, Emma kept giggling, the sound echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "We have to get out," I said. "She's out there," Jake protested. "She's in here too." I was right. Emma's voice was now definitely coming from inside the RV, though I still couldn't see her. She was narrating her scratching like a child describing her artwork. "This one's for the man with the camera," she said as fresh marks appeared on the ceiling above our heads. "He tried to take pictures of me, but the camera just showed trees. Trees and bones." More scratching, more symbols. "This one's for the family with the boys. The little ones cried when they saw me, but they stopped crying when the trees started singing." I couldn't take it anymore. I lunged for the door and yanked it open. The clearing was empty. Our fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to make out the edges of the forest. No sign of Emma, no sign of anyone. But the scratching continued behind us, and her voice kept up its cheerful commentary. "And this one," she said, "is for you." I looked back at the RV and screamed. The entire vehicle was covered in those impossible symbols, carved so deep they'd penetrated the aluminum skin. But worse than that, the symbols were moving. They shifted and crawled across the surface like living things, rearranging themselves into new patterns, new messages I couldn't read but somehow understood. They were coordinates, directions, instructions for finding something buried under the trees. Jake stumbled out behind me, saw what I was seeing, and went completely white. "What the hell? Run!" I said. We ran. Into the forest, away from the clearing, away from the RV and Emma's voice and the writhing symbols. Tree branches tore at our clothes and faces, but we didn't slow down. Behind us, Emma's laughter followed, echoing from every direction like surround sound. "You can't hide in my woods," she called after us. "I know every tree, every root, every shadow. This is where I live now." We crashed through the underbrush, guided only by the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy. I had no idea which direction we were going, No plan beyond getting as far as possible from that cursed clearing. Jake's hand found mine in the darkness, and we stumbled forward together. But the forest had other ideas. No matter which way we turned, no matter how far we ran, we kept finding ourselves back at the clearing. The RV sat waiting for us, still covered in those moving symbols, still emanating that sense of wrongness that made my teeth ache. "This is impossible," Jake gasped, bent over with his hands on his knees. "We've been running in a straight line." "It's the trees," I said, looking around at the circle of pines that surrounded us. "They're not letting us leave." Even as I said it, I could see it was true. The trees were different now, arranged in patterns that defied natural growth. They formed corridors and dead ends, a maze designed to funnel us back to where Emma waited. "Hello again." Her voice drifted from the RV. "I told you hide and seek was my favorite game." We tried again, choosing a different direction, moving more carefully. But every path led back to the clearing. Every escape route curved around until we found ourselves staring at our own vehicle and Emma's impossible handiwork. On the fourth attempt, Jake stopped running and turned to face the forest. "Emma," he called out. "Emma, we know you can hear us. We want to help you." His voice was swallowed by the trees before it traveled more than a few feet, but Emma's giggle came back immediately. "You want to help me?" she asked. "Then stay. Play with me." The others tried to leave, and look what happened to them. She emerged from behind the RV, and I finally saw her clearly. Emma was a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with blonde hair and pigtails and a dirty white dress that might once have been clean. She looked perfectly normal except for her eyes, which reflected the firelight like an animal's, and the fact that her feet didn't quite touch the ground. "See?" she said, spreading her arms wide. "I'm not scary. I'm just lonely." But as she moved closer, I could see the wrongness in her proportions. Her arms were too long, her fingers too thin. Her smile was too wide, revealing too many teeth. And when she turned her head, it rotated further than any human neck should allow. "The trees brought you here for me," she continued, drifting rather than walking across the clearing. "They know I need friends. They know I get sad when I'm all alone." "Emma," Jake said carefully, "what happened to your parents?" She tilted her head, and I heard her neck bones creak like old wood. "They went to sleep. Everyone goes to sleep eventually. But I don't need to sleep anymore. The trees taught me how to stay awake forever." She gestured toward the forest, and for the first time I noticed the shapes among the trees. What I'd taken for fallen logs or natural formations were something else entirely. Bodies, arranged in neat rows between the trunks. Some were old enough to be just bones and scraps of clothing. Others looked more recent. "They're all still here," Emma said proudly. "All my friends. The trees keep them safe and quiet so they can play with me whenever I want." I counted at least a dozen bodies in the small section of forest I could see. Men, women, children, all positioned as if sleeping peacefully, all perfectly preserved by whatever force had claimed this place. "You're going to like it here," Emma assured us. "It's very peaceful, very quiet. The trees will sing you to sleep, and then you'll never have to worry about anything again." That's when I noticed the sound, or rather, the absence of it. The supernatural silence that had first welcomed us to this place wasn't natural. It was active, aggressive. It was the forest itself absorbing every noise, every echo, every possible call for help. "Emma," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "we can't stay. People will come looking for us." Her smile faltered. "No, they won't. The trees make sure of that. People forget about this place. They forget about the road. They forget about anyone who comes here." She was right, I realized. We'd made no real plans, told no one exactly where we were going. The GPS had malfunctioned, our phones were dead, and the road we'd taken wasn't on any official map. We could disappear completely, and no one would ever know where to look. "Please," Jake said. "We have families. People who love us." Emma's head snapped toward him with that disturbing range of motion. "I had a family too. But families end. The trees don't end. The trees remember everything, and they'll remember you." She began to hum again. that wrong lullaby that seemed to come from the forest itself. As the melody grew louder, I felt something changing in the air around us. The pressure increased, pressing against my ears, my lungs, my thoughts. The trees swayed without wind, their branches reaching toward us like grasping fingers. "Sleep," Emma whispered, though her lips didn't move. The word seemed to come from the trees themselves. Sleep and dream and never wake. Jake swayed on his feet, his eyelids growing heavy. I felt it too, a profound exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the weight of giving up, of surrendering to something vast and patient and hungry, but I fought it. I grabbed Jake's arm and shook him hard. "Stay awake," I hissed. "Don't listen to her." He blinked, shaking his head as if trying to clear water from his ears. Emma's face contorted with disappointment. "That's not how the game works," she said, and her voice was no longer childish. It was something old and bitter wearing a child's shape. "Everyone has to sleep eventually." The trees pressed closer, their trunks groaning as they moved. I realized with growing horror that the entire forest was alive, was a part of Emma, or she was part of it. The boundaries between the girl and the woods had long since dissolved. "The car keys," I whispered to Jake. "Where are the car keys?" He patted his pockets, still groggy from Emma's influence. "In the RV, on the counter." I looked at our vehicle, still covered in those writhing symbols, still radiating wrongness. But it was our only chance. "When I say run," I told Jake, "we go for the RV, get the keys, and get out of here." "The engine won't start," he protested. "Maybe it will now." It was a desperate hope, but desperation was all we had left. Emma was still humming, still trying to lure us into that deadly sleep, but she seemed focused on maintaining whatever power kept the trees moving. "Run," I said. We sprinted for the RV. Emma's humming cut off with a shriek of rage, and the trees exploded into motion, their branches whipping through the air like enormous tentacles. One caught Jake across the back, sending him stumbling, but he kept moving. I reached the RV first and threw open the door. The symbols on the walls were glowing now, pulsing with sick light. The keys were where Jake had left them, but when I grabbed them, they burned like ice against my palm. Jake tumbled in behind me as branches smashed against the windows. I thrust the keys at him and he lunged for the driver's seat. "Drive!" I screamed. "Just drive!" He turned the key, and miraculously the engine caught. It sputtered and wheezed, but it ran. Jake threw the transmission into gear and floored the accelerator. The RV lurched forward, smashing through the circle of moving trees. Branches scraped and tore at the roof and sides, but the vehicle's momentum carried us through. Behind us, Emma's voice rose to an inhuman wail that shattered every window in the RV. But we were moving. The forest blurred past as Jake navigated the narrow dirt road by instinct and desperation. I could hear things crashing through the trees behind us, following, but gradually the sounds faded. The road seemed longer on the way out, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember from our arrival. But eventually, impossibly, we saw the glow of streetlights ahead. The main highway materialized out of the darkness like a lifeline thrown to drowning swimmers. Jake pulled onto the pavement and kept driving, neither of us speaking until the forest was just a dark line in our rearview mirror. Only then did he pull over at a gas station and we both started shaking. The attendant, a tired-looking man in his 50s, came out to check on us when he saw our condition. Our clothes were torn, our faces were scratched from the branches, and the RV looked like it had been attacked by a pack of wild animals. "You folks okay?" he asked. "Looks like you had some trouble." "We need to call the police," I said. "There's something in the forest. A child, but not a child. Bodies. People who've gone missing." The attendant frowned. "What forest?" I pointed back the way we'd come, but there was nothing there. Just empty highway stretching into darkness. "You came from the south," the attendant said. "That's just open country down that way. No forest for 50 miles. Jake and I looked at each other. We both knew what we'd seen, what we'd experienced. But when I pulled out my phone to show him our GPS history, the device was completely dead. Not just drained, fried, as if it had been hit by lightning. The police were polite but skeptical. They took our report, but when they tried to find the dirt road we'd described, There was no record of it on any map. The Crystal Creek campground didn't exist in their database. As far as the state of Oregon was concerned, we'd never been anywhere at all. We drove home in silence, both of us jumping at every shadow, every rustle of wind through trees. The RV had to be totaled. The insurance adjuster had never seen damage like it, and couldn't explain how the strange symbols had been burned so deep into the metal. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night, that makes me check and double-check every lock in our house. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear Emma humming. Not loudly, not clearly, but there nonetheless. A child's lullaby drifting through the walls, reminding me that some games never really end. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night and I see a dirt road branching off into dark trees, I have to fight the urge to turn, because part of me knows that Emma is still out there, still playing hide-and-seek, still waiting for someone to find her clearing where the trees remember everything and silence hunts like a living thing. The doctors say it's trauma, that our minds are trying to process an experience too strange to accept. They've given me pills for the anxiety, therapy sessions to help me integrate the experience into a healthy worldview. But they weren't there. They didn't see the bodies arranged like sleeping children between the trees, didn't feel the forest itself pressing against their thoughts, didn't hear a dead child's voice promising eternal playmates. Jake won't talk about it anymore. He's thrown himself into work, picking up every extra shift he can get. When he does come home, he drinks until he can sleep without dreams. We don't go camping anymore. We don't even drive through wooded areas if we can help it. But I remember everything. Every detail of that impossible clearing. Every word of Emma's terrible lullaby. And sometimes in the deepest part of the night, when the world is finally quiet, I can hear her voice calling my name across impossible distances. "Sarah," she whispers. "Sarah, don't you want to come back and play?" The silence hunts, and it's patient, and someday it will find me again. Story 4. I'm Daniel, 34, and when I reached the Ozark National Scenic Riverways in Missouri, the air pressed against me like a hand. The weight of it should have been my first warning, but I was too focused on finding the perfect spot to park our rented RV along the current river. My wife, Sarah, sat beside me, her fingers drumming nervously on the passenger door as we navigated the winding gravel road deeper into the forest. "This is far enough," she said, her voice tight with the anxiety that had been building since we left St. Louis 3 days ago. "Let's just stop here." But I could see the river through the trees, glinting silver in the late afternoon sun, and I wanted to get closer. Sarah had been dealing with panic attacks since losing her job 6 months ago, and this trip was supposed to help her relax. The therapist had recommended nature, solitude, a chance to reconnect. What I didn't tell Sarah was that I'd been having my own problems. Sleeping poorly, seeing shapes in my peripheral vision, feeling like someone was always just behind me. The stress of being the sole breadwinner while she struggled had been eating away at me. "Just a little further," I said, guiding our 28-foot Forest River Cherokee down a particularly narrow stretch. "Look, there's a clearing ahead." The clearing opened up like a cathedral, tall oak and hickory trees forming a natural wall around a patch of level ground that seemed designed for camping. The current river curved lazily past, its waters dark and still. Perfect. Too perfect, maybe. But I pushed that thought away as I maneuvered the RV into position. Sarah climbed out first, stretching her arms above her head. At 32, she still moved with the grace of the dancer she'd been in college, though the stress of recent months had carved new lines around her green eyes. Her auburn hair caught the fading light as she surveyed our surroundings. "It's beautiful," she admitted, and I felt a surge of relief. "Really beautiful, Daniel. Good choice." I was hooking up the electrical when I first saw him, or thought I saw him. A figure standing about 50 feet away, partially hidden behind a massive oak tree. He looked exactly like me. Same height, same build, same dark hair and beard, even the same blue flannel shirt I was wearing. But when I blinked and looked again, he was gone. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, following my gaze. "Yeah, just thought I saw..." "Nothing. Probably just a deer." We spent the rest of the evening setting up camp, extending the awning, arranging our chairs by the river. Sarah seemed more relaxed than she'd been in months, laughing as she struggled with the Coleman lantern, humming while she organized our supplies. For the first time since her breakdown, she seemed like herself again. As darkness settled over the forest, we built a small fire in the designated ring someone had left behind. The flames danced hypnotically, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Every few minutes, I thought I caught movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing but trees and darkness. "Tell me again why we couldn't just go to a nice hotel in Branson," Sarah said, poking at the fire with the stick. She was smiling, though, and I could see the tension leaving her shoulders. "Because you need this," I said, gesturing at the wilderness around us. "We both do. No phones, no internet, no neighbors playing loud music at midnight. Just us and—" A branch cracked somewhere behind us, loud and sharp as a gunshot. We both froze, listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing but the soft whisper of the river. "Probably just a raccoon," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. Sarah moved closer to me, her hand finding mine. "I don't like this, Daniel. Something feels wrong." I wanted to dismiss her concerns, to chalk it up to her anxiety, but the truth was, I felt it too. A wrongness in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the pressure drops and every animal goes quiet. "Let's go inside," I said. We extinguished the fire and retreated to the RV, locking the door behind us. The interior felt cramped after the vastness of the forest, but also safe, secure. Sarah curled up on the dinette bench while I checked and rechecked the locks on the door and windows. "You're scaring me," she said. "I'm just being careful." "No, you're being paranoid. You've been like this for weeks, Daniel. Always looking over your shoulder, jumping at shadows. Maybe you should talk to someone." "I don't need to talk to anyone," I snapped, then immediately regretted my tone. "Sorry, I'm just tired." But I couldn't sleep. I lay in our bed listening to Sarah's breathing gradually slow and deepen while my mind raced. Every sound outside, and there were many, sent a spike of adrenaline through my system. The creak of settling wood, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Normal forest sounds, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. They were careful, deliberate, circling the RV at a steady pace, heavy boots on the soft forest floor, stopping occasionally as if the walker was examining something. I slipped out of bed and crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver and shadow. I could see the outline of our chairs around the dead fire pit, the dark bulk of trees beyond, but no person. The footsteps continued their circuit, and I pressed my face to the glass, trying to track the sound. That's when I saw him again. He was standing directly in front of the RV, maybe 10 feet away, staring up at the window where I was hiding. In the moonlight, his face was clearly visible, and it was my face. Not similar, not close enough to be mistaken. Identical. The same scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the same crooked nose broken playing high school football, the same beard that Sarah always said needed trimming. But his eyes were wrong, completely black, like holes burned in paper. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I looked again, he was gone. "Daniel?" Sarah's voice was thick with sleep. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I whispered. "Go back to sleep." But she was already sitting up, instantly alert in the way she'd developed since her anxiety got bad. Something woke me up. What was it? I couldn't tell her what I'd seen. She was finally relaxing, finally sleeping through the night without medication. I thought I heard something outside, probably just an animal. She joined me at the window and we both stared out into the forest. Everything looked peaceful, normal. The moonlight painted the clearing in soft grays and blacks, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves. "See?" I said. "Nothing there." But even as I said it, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Our 2 camping chairs, which we'd left side by side facing the river, had been moved. Now there was a 3rd chair between them, identical to ours, arranged as if someone had joined our little campfire circle. Sarah saw it too. Her hand found my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Daniel, we didn't bring 3 chairs." I was already reaching for my clothes, pulling on jeans and a sweatshirt. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." "Don't you dare go out there." "I have to check it out." "No, you don't. We can leave right now. Pack up and drive straight home." The rational part of my mind agreed with her completely. But something else, some deeper instinct, told me that running wouldn't help. Whatever was happening here would follow us. I could feel it with absolute certainty. "Sarah, listen to me. I need you to stay inside and keep the doors locked. If anything happens, anything at all, you drive straight to the ranger station. Don't wait for me." She was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "Please don't do this. Please." I kissed her forehead, tasting salt. "I'll be right back." The night air was cool and damp against my face as I stepped outside. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the 3 chairs in stark detail. The new one was identical to ours in every way. Same brand, same faded blue fabric, even the same small tear in the left armrest that I'd been meaning to repair. I circled the chairs slowly, playing my light over the ground. There were footprints in the soft earth, boot prints that matched my own hiking boots exactly. They led from the tree line to the chairs, then continued around the RV in the same pattern I'd heard earlier. Following the trail, I moved deeper into the forest. The prints were clear in the damp soil, and they told a story that made less sense with each step. They didn't come from anywhere. They simply appeared at the edge of the clearing as if the person making them had dropped from the sky. And they were too perfect, too exact. I knelt down and compared one to my own foot. The tread pattern was identical, but more than that. They showed the same worn spots, the same distinctive scuff mark on the right heel that I'd gotten from dragging my foot getting out of the car. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across the trees. Nothing. But now the footprints continued past where I was standing, heading deeper into the forest. Fresh prints, still damp around the edges. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. My own voice answered back, echoing from somewhere ahead. "Who's there?" Not an echo. The same words, in my exact voice, but with a quality that raised goosebumps along my arms. There was amusement in it, like someone enjoying a private joke. I should have gone back to the RV then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but my feet carried me forward, following the prints deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around me, their branches forming a canopy so thick that my flashlight beam seemed to die just a few feet ahead. The trail led to a small clearing where someone had built a fire. Recent, maybe only a few hours old, the coals still warm when I held my hand over them. Arranged around the fire pit were 3 logs, positioned exactly like the chairs back at our campsite. On one of them sat my backpack, the same model and color as the one I'd left in the RV, but this one was older, more worn, with stains I didn't remember. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside were my belongings, but wrong somehow. My wallet, containing my driver's license and credit cards, but the photo showed me with longer hair and a different expression. A small notebook I'd never seen before, filled with my own handwriting documenting our trip, but describing events that hadn't happened. According to the entries, we'd been camping here for over a week. Sarah had been acting strange. I'd been seeing things in the forest that shouldn't be there. The final entry, dated today, was just 3 words repeated over and over. "He found me. He found me. He found me." Interesting reading? I spun around. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, close enough that I could see his face clearly in my flashlight beam. My face, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite define. The features were all correct, but the arrangement was slightly off, like a photograph that had been manipulated just enough to create an uncanny valley effect. "What do you want?" I managed to ask. "What I want." He smiled, and it was exactly how I smiled when I was pleased about something. "I want your life, Daniel, your wife, your worries, your memories, everything that makes you, you. That's impossible, is it?" He took a step closer, and I noticed he wasn't casting a shadow despite the bright beam of my flashlight hitting him directly. "You've been feeling it for months, haven't you? The sense that something's watching you, the shapes in your peripheral vision? That's been me, Daniel. Learning, studying, becoming." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. "You're not real. I'm more real than you are." Another step closer. "I know things about you that you don't even know about yourself. I know you've been having dreams about drowning. I know you check the locks on your house 3 times every night because you're afraid someone's going to break in and hurt Sarah. I know you sometimes stand in the bathroom at 3 a.m., staring at yourself in the mirror, wondering if you're losing your mind." All of that was true, but I'd never told anyone, not even Sarah. "How do you—" "Because I am you, Daniel. The real you. You're just the shadow I'm ready to discard." He was close enough to touch now, and I could see that his eyes weren't completely black as I'd thought. They were my eyes, but filmed over with something dark and oily. When he spoke, I could smell something rotten on his breath. "Sarah's been worried about you, you know. Your paranoia, your sleeplessness. She thinks you might be having a breakdown. And maybe you are." His smile widened. "Maybe you've been having a breakdown for months, and this whole trip is just another hallucination. Maybe I'm just another hallucination. Stop it. Or maybe you're the hallucination. Maybe you died months ago, a heart attack brought on by stress, and Sarah's been talking to an empty house this whole time. Maybe that's why you've been feeling so disconnected, so unreal." "Stop it." I swung the flashlight at his head, but it passed right through him like he was made of smoke. He laughed. My laugh. And suddenly, he was behind me, his breath cold against my neck. "Run along back to Sarah now," he whispered. "But remember, she's going to start noticing the changes, little things at first, the way you hold your fork, the way you laugh at her jokes. She's very observant, your Sarah. It won't take her long to realize something's different." I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I crashed through the underbrush, following my flashlight beam back toward the river. Behind me, I could hear him laughing, the sound echoing from multiple directions as if there were dozens of him scattered through the trees. I burst into the clearing where our RV sat, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Sarah must have heard me coming because she threw open the door before I could knock. "Daniel, thank God, I was so worried." She stopped, studying my face. "You look terrible. What happened?" I wanted to tell her everything, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? "I got lost," I said finally. "Turned around in the dark." She pulled me inside and locked the door, then checked all the other locks while I sat at the dinette table, trying to stop my hands from shaking. She made me tea and held me while I gradually calmed down. "We're leaving in the morning," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice, but morning brought new horrors. I woke up before dawn with the absolute certainty that someone was inside the RV with us. I lay perfectly still, listening. Sarah was breathing normally beside me, but there was another sound, the soft whisper of fabric against fabric, like someone moving very carefully through the main compartment. The floorboard creaked near the dinette. I slipped out of bed and crept toward the bedroom door, which we'd left partially open for air circulation. Through the gap, I could see a figure silhouetted against the window. He was standing with his back to me, looking out at the forest, and in the gray pre-dawn light he was unmistakably me. But he was wearing clothes I didn't recognize. A green sweater Sarah had bought me for Christmas that I'd never liked enough to wear. His hair was combed differently, parted on the right instead of the left, and when he moved, it was with a confidence I'd never possessed, a fluidity that seemed almost inhuman. As I watched, he turned toward the bedroom, and I ducked back behind the door. I could hear him moving closer, his footsteps silent on the carpet. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. "Daniel?" Sarah's voice, soft and confused. "What are you doing?" I turned to look at her, and she was staring past me toward the door. Following her gaze, I saw him standing in the doorway, smiling down at us with my face. "Just checking on you," he said in my voice. "Go back to sleep." Sarah blinked slowly, and I could see the confusion in her eyes. She looked back and forth between us, me crouched beside the bed, him standing calmly in the doorway, and I watched as her mind tried to process what she was seeing. "Daniel," she said again, but this time there was fear in her voice. "I'm here," I said. "I'm here." he said at the same time in perfect synchronization. Sarah screamed. The sound seemed to break whatever spell was holding us frozen. I lunged toward the door, but he was already moving, flowing past me like water. Sarah was scrambling backward against the headboard, her eyes wide with terror. "Sarah, it's me," I said. "The real me. Don't listen to him." "Sarah, it's me," he echoed. "Don't listen to him." She looked back and forth between us, hyperventilating. "This isn't real. This isn't real. I'm having another panic attack. This isn't real." "Look at me," I said, moving slowly toward her. "Really, look at me. You know me, Sarah. You know my voice, my mannerisms. Look at my eyes." "Look at me," he said, moving from the other side. "Really, look at me. You know me, Sarah. You know my voice, my mannerisms. Look at my eyes." But when Sarah looked at him, she recoiled. "Your eyes," she whispered. "Something's wrong with your eyes." He stepped back into the shadows, and I couldn't see his face clearly anymore. "There's nothing wrong with my eyes," he said, but his voice had changed slightly. Less warm, less human. "Sarah, we need to get out of here right now," I said. "Sarah, we need to get out of here right now," he repeated, but a fraction of a second later, like an echo. That's when I realized something important. He could copy me, but he couldn't predict me. He was reacting to what I said and did, not anticipating it. "Red bicycle," I said suddenly. He paused just for a moment before saying, "Red bicycle." Sarah caught the hesitation too, her eyes fixed on me, searching my face. "What red bicycle?" "The one you had when you were 7, I said, not taking my eyes off the other me. "With the streamers on the handlebars and the bell that sounded like a dying cat. You crashed it into Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses and got grounded for a week." Sarah had told me that story on our 3rd date, laughing about her childhood clumsiness. It wasn't something I would have any reason to bring up now, unless I was trying to prove something. The other me just stared, his mouth slightly open. "You told me about it at Rosario's," I continued. "That little Italian place where you had the seafood pasta and I had the lasagna that was too salty. You spilled marinara sauce on your white blouse and wanted to go home and change, but I told you it looked like abstract art." "Daniel," Sarah breathed, and I could see recognition in her eyes. The other me tried to speak, but only gibberish came out, as if he was buffering like a broken computer. His face began to change, features shifting and blurring like melting wax. "Run," I said. We bolted for the door, Sarah ahead of me, both of us stumbling in our pajamas. Behind us, the thing that wasn't me let out a sound that was half shriek, half laughter, a noise no human throat could make. The morning air was cold and damp, and our bare feet slipped on the wet grass as we ran toward the truck I'd used to tow the RV. Sarah was crying, gasping out half-formed questions that I couldn't answer because I didn't understand what was happening any better than she did. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. In the rearview mirror, I could see the RV door hanging open, but nothing emerged from the darkness inside. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, and I threw it into reverse, not caring about proper procedures or safety checks. We needed to get away from this place, away from whatever had followed us here or been waiting for us. But as we reached the main road, Sarah grabbed my arm. "Stop." I looked where she was pointing and felt my blood turn to ice. Standing in the middle of the gravel road was another figure, identical to me, but wearing different clothes. This one was dressed in the jeans and flannel shirt I'd been wearing the night before. I swerved to avoid him, but as we passed, he turned to follow us with his eyes, and his mouth opened in that same inhuman shriek. "Drive faster," Sarah whispered. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, sending gravel spraying behind us. The forest blurred past the windows as we climbed toward the main highway, but every shadow seemed to contain another figure, another version of me standing among the trees. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station in Van Buren, 40 miles away. Sarah called the police while I filled the tank, both of us looking over our shoulders constantly. But what could we tell them? That we'd encountered supernatural duplicates of myself in the forest? They'd think we were having some kind of shared psychotic break. In the end, we told them we'd encountered a prowler at our campsite and felt unsafe. They took a report and promised to send someone to check the area, but I could see in their eyes that they thought we were just city people spooked by normal forest sounds. We drove straight home to St. Louis, barely speaking during the 6-hour trip. Sarah kept studying my face when she thought I wasn't looking, and I didn't blame her. How could she be sure I was really me? How could I be sure? That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, things have been different between us. Sarah watches me constantly, looking for signs that I'm not who I appear to be. She asks me random questions about our shared past, testing my memory. She started sleeping in the guest room, claiming she's been having nightmares, but I know she's afraid of me. And the terrible thing is, I'm not sure she's wrong to be afraid, because I've been changing. Little things at first. I find myself holding my fork differently, laughing at jokes that didn't used to amuse me. I catch myself staring in mirrors for long periods, studying my reflection as if it might reveal some fundamental alteration I can't detect. My handwriting has changed. Not drastically, but enough that Sarah noticed when I wrote a grocery list last week. The way I walk is different too, more confident, more fluid. Sometimes I feel like I'm watching myself from outside my body, observing these changes with the detached curiosity of a scientist. And then there are the dreams. Every night, I dream about the forest, about standing among the trees, looking down at our RV with Sarah sleeping inside. In the dreams, I'm not alone. There are others like me scattered through the darkness, all of us wearing different versions of my face, all of us watching and waiting. Sometimes in these dreams, I remember things that didn't happen, conversations I never had, places I never went, a life that feels more real than my actual memories. I remember Sarah differently too, not as my wife, but as something I studied, something I learned to imitate. In the dreams, I remember being the thing in the forest. This morning, I woke up with dirt under my fingernails, though I haven't been outside since yesterday. Sarah was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching me with those careful, fearful eyes. "Daniel," she said, "we need to talk." I sat down across from her, noticing how she leaned away slightly when I got close. "I've been thinking about what happened," she continued, "about what we saw in the forest, and I think maybe you should see someone, a doctor, because some of the things you've been doing lately." "Like what?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "Last night you got up around 3 a.m. and went to the bathroom, but you didn't turn on the light and you didn't make any noise. I watched you through the crack in the door, and you were just standing there in the dark, staring at yourself in the mirror. I didn't remember doing that, but it sounded familiar, like something from a dream. And your voice," she continued, "sometimes when you're not paying attention, it sounds different, flatter, less human." "Sarah, are you really Daniel?" The question hung in the air between us like a physical thing. "Are you really my husband?" I wanted to say yes, of course I was, but the words wouldn't come. Because lying in bed at night listening to her breathe beside me, I sometimes felt like an imposter learning to play a role. Sometimes when she looked at me with love and trust, I felt like I was deceiving her in ways I couldn't explain. "I think so," I said finally, and watched the last hope die in her eyes. She nodded slowly, unsurprised by my answer. "I've already packed a bag," she said. "I'm going to stay with my sister for a while, until I figure out what's real and what isn't." I should have argued. The old Daniel would have fought for his marriage, would have insisted on couples therapy or demanded she trust him. But I just sat there, watching her go with the same detached curiosity I brought to everything these days. After she left, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, studying my reflection. I looked like Daniel Morrison, 34 years old, systems analyst from St. Louis. But when I smiled, something seemed wrong with the expression. When I blinked, the timing felt slightly off. And in the back of my mind, I could hear something laughing, a sound like wind through dead leaves, like water over stone, like the voice of the forest itself. I think Sarah was right to leave. I think something else came back from those woods in Daniel's place. Something that learned to wear his face and speak with his voice but never quite mastered the deeper magic of being human. I think the real Daniel is still out there in the Ozark forest, standing among the trees with all the other lost souls, watching and waiting for the next travelers foolish enough to venture too deep into places where the boundaries between self and other grow thin. And I think, as I sit here writing this in Daniel's handwriting with Daniel's memories, that I'm becoming more real every day while he fades a little further into shadow. The terrible thing is, I'm starting to like it here. This house, this life, these borrowed memories. They fit me better each day, like a coat I'm still growing into. Sometimes I wonder if Sarah will come back, if she'll decide that whatever I am now is close enough to what she lost, if she'll choose the comfortable lie over the impossible truth. I hope she doesn't. Because late at night, when the house is quiet and still, I can feel the pull of the forest calling me back. I can hear my brothers singing among the trees, their voices harmonizing in frequencies no human ear was meant to detect. And I know that if she returns, if she lets her guard down and learns to love this thing that wears her husband's face, she'll wake up one morning to find a fourth chair arranged around some distant campfire, with something new and hungry learning the precise rhythm of her breath. The forest is patient. The forest is always patient. And there are so many travelers still to meet. Story 5. I'm Lily, 34. The first drop of rain at Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas tasted like blood. I should have turned the RV around right then. Should have listened to that primal voice screaming in the back of my mind. But Marcus was already unbuckling his seatbelt, grinning at me with that boyish excitement that had made me fall in love with him 3 years ago. "Look at this place, Lil," he said, pressing his face against the passenger window. "It's perfect." Perfect wasn't the word I'd have chosen. The campground sat in a hollow between towering bluffs of sandstone, their surfaces scarred with caves and crevices that looked like screaming mouths. Ancient cedars twisted toward the gray sky, their branches intertwined like arthritic fingers. Even in daylight, the shadows between the trees seemed too deep, too hungry. But Marcus had been planning this trip for months, ever since his company laid him off. He needed this escape, this chance to pretend we weren't drowning in bills and unemployment stress. So I forced a smile and pulled our rented RV into the campsite he'd reserved. Site 17, isolated at the far end of the loop, exactly the kind of secluded spot he preferred. "Just the two of us and Mother Nature," he said, already moving toward the door. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the silence. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of that strange rain beginning to patter against the windshield, each droplet leaving a reddish streak as it ran down the glass. "Marcus," I called, but he was already outside, breathing deep lungfuls of the heavy air. The metallic taste in my mouth intensified as I stepped out of the RV. The rain was warm against my skin, warmer than it should have been for late October in Arkansas. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stared at the pink smear across my knuckles. "This rain," I started to say, but Marcus was already pulling equipment from the RV's storage compartments. "Probably just iron in the water," he said without looking up. "You know how these old mountains are, full of minerals." But I knew the taste of blood. I'd been a surgical tech for 8 years before the hospital downsized my department. This wasn't iron. This was something else entirely. The rain intensified as we set up our campsite, transforming from a light drizzle to a steady downpour that drummed against the RV's roof like fingernails. Marcus strung our awning between two gnarled oaks, whistling some tune I didn't recognize. The melody sounded wrong somehow, discordant notes that made my teeth ache. "Where did you learn that song?" I asked. He paused, tying off a guy line. "What song?" "The one you were just whistling." I wasn't whistling, but I'd heard it clearly. That twisted melody that seemed to echo off the stone bluffs surrounding us. I was about to argue when something caught my eye. A flash of movement in the woods beyond our campsite. A pale shape, roughly human-sized, darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" Marcus followed my gaze. "See what?" The woods were still now, nothing but rain-darkened trunks and that oppressive silence, but I could have sworn. "Nothing," I said. "Just thought I saw something." We finished setting up as the afternoon light faded to a sickly yellow glow filtered through the storm clouds. The rain never stopped, never even slowed, and it never stopped tasting like copper and salt. By evening, everything in our campsite had taken on a pinkish hue. Our chairs, the picnic table, even Marcus's hair. "We should go inside," I said, hugging myself against the unnatural chill that had settled over the hollow. "Come on, Lil. When's the last time we sat by a campfire together? We can't start a fire in this weather." But Marcus was already stacking wood under the awning, arranging kindling with the focused intensity he brought to everything he cared about. It was one of the things I loved about him, his ability to create order from chaos, to make any situation work. He'd gotten our fire started in torrential downpours before, except tonight, the wood wouldn't catch. He tried everything: newspaper, fire starters, even lighter fluid he'd brought as backup. The flames would sputter to life for a few seconds, then die with a hiss that sounded almost like laughter. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, crouched over the fire ring. "This wood should be bone dry. I stored it in the RV all week." I watched him try again, and this time something different happened. The flames caught, rising higher than they should have, and they weren't the normal orange and yellow of burning wood. They were red, deep, arterial red, and they cast everything in our campsite in shades of crimson. "Marcus, finally got it going," he said, sitting back on his heels with satisfaction. "Told you we'd have our campfire. The flames are red." He turned to look at me, his face bathed in that bloody light. "What are you talking about? Fire is fire, Lil." But even as he spoke, I could see the confusion in his eyes. He was seeing it too, I realized. Seeing it and choosing to ignore it. The way he'd been ignoring everything strange about this place since we arrived. We sat in our camp chairs, watching the impossible fire burn, listening to the rain drum against the awning overhead. The red light made everything look diseased, transformed. Marcus's hands looked like they were covered in blood. My own reflection in the RV's window looked like something that had crawled out of a grave. "Tell me about your day," Marcus said, in that forced, cheerful voice he used when he was trying to pretend everything was normal. "You were there for my whole day. Before that, this week, I tried to remember, but the memories felt slippery, insubstantial. Had I worked this week? Had I even left our apartment?" The days since Marcus lost his job had blurred together into a gray haze of job applications and mounting bills and increasing desperation. "I can't remember," I said finally. "Me neither." He stared into the red flames. "Isn't that weird? I mean, we drove here this morning, but I can't remember where we drove from." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "Of course you remember. We live in Little Rock." "Do we? We've lived there for 2 years. Ever since you got the job at—" I stopped. What job? What company had laid him off? The information was there, somewhere in my mind. But when I reached for it, it slipped away like smoke. "What's our address?" Marcus asked quietly. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't. I could picture our apartment, the cramped kitchen, the bedroom with the water stain on the ceiling, the living room where we'd planned this trip. But I couldn't remember the street name. Couldn't remember the building number. "This is just stress," I said, my voice tight with panic. "People forget things when they're stressed." "What's your middle name, Lily?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him across the fire. This man I'd been with for 3 years. This man I loved. And I couldn't remember my own middle name. Couldn't remember my maiden name. Couldn't remember anything about myself before Marcus. "What's happening to us?" I whispered. Before he could answer, we heard it. A sound drifting through the rain-soaked woods. Children laughing. High, sweet voices echoing off the stone bluffs, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Marcus stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" The laughter continued. That innocent sound made sinister by the isolation and the red light of our impossible fire. It seemed to circle our campsite, moving through the trees just beyond the reach of the flames. "There aren't supposed to be kids here," I said. "This isn't a family campground." "Maybe they're from another site." But we both knew we were alone. We'd driven the entire loop when we arrived, hadn't seen another RV or tent anywhere in the campground. The office had been closed, a handwritten sign saying, "Back in 30 minutes," taped to the door. We'd been waiting for someone to return when Marcus spotted the key to Site 17 hanging on a hook with our name already written on the tag. The laughter grew closer, and with it came other sounds. Footsteps in the wet leaves, twigs snapping under small feet, the whisper of fabric brushing against branches. "We should go inside," I said, but my voice was barely audible over the rain. Marcus was turning in slow circles, trying to locate the source of the sounds. "Kids," he called out, "are you lost? Do you need help?" That's when I saw them. They emerged from the woods like pale flowers blooming in the darkness. 3 children, maybe 8 or 9 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothing that looked like something from a daguerreotype. A girl in a white pinafore, her hair in long braids. 2 boys in knickers and suspenders, their faces serious and too adult for their years. But their eyes, oh God, their eyes. They were black, not brown, not dark blue, black as pitch, black as the spaces between stars. And they were wrong, all wrong, too large for their faces, unblinking, ancient. "Hello," the girl said, her voice carrying clearly through the rain. "We're lost." Marcus took a step toward them and I grabbed his arm. "Don't." "Lily, they're just kids." "Look at their eyes." But when I pointed, the children were gone, vanished as if they'd never been there at all, leaving only the sound of laughter echoing from deeper in the woods. Marcus shook off my grip. "Where did they go?" "We need to get in the RV, now." "But if they're lost, those aren't children, Marcus." I was already moving toward the RV door, fishing the keys from my pocket with shaking hands. Behind me, I could hear Marcus calling out into the woods, asking if the children were okay, offering help. The laughter came again, closer this time from inside our campsite. I turned around and saw them standing in the red glow of our fire. All 3 of them, motionless as statues, their black eyes fixed on Marcus. Up close, I could see that their clothes weren't just old-fashioned. They were rotted, moldering, falling apart at the seams. The girl's braids were matted with leaves and something that looked like grave soil. "Can we come inside?" the girl asked. "We're very cold," and that's when I noticed the rain wasn't touching them. It was falling all around them, but not a single drop landed on their pale skin or their decaying clothes. "Marcus, get away from them." But he was already approaching the children, his hands outstretched in that universal gesture of adult reassurance. "Of course you can come inside. Where are your parents?" "Dead," said one of the boys matter-of-factly. "Dead and buried in the old cemetery." "For a very long time," added the other boy. The girl smiled, revealing teeth that were black as her eyes. "But we don't like being alone." I yanked the RV door open and lunged for Marcus, grabbing his shirt and hauling him backward. "Get in the RV." "Lily, what's wrong with you? They need help." But even as he protested, I could see the fear creeping into his eyes. Whatever these things were pretending to be, some part of him recognized the predators beneath the innocent faces. I shoved him through the door and slammed it behind us, throwing the deadbolt and backing away from the windows. Outside, the children's laughter had turned to something else, a sound like wind through a cemetery, like voices calling from the bottom of a well. "What were those things?" Marcus whispered. "I don't know." We stood in the narrow aisle of the RV, listening to the sounds outside. Footsteps on the roof, scratching at the windows, a rhythmic tapping that might have been knocking if you could ignore the fact that it was coming from underneath the RV. "This is insane," Marcus said. "We're adults. We're hiding from children. Those weren't children. Then what were they?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the rain was still falling, still that impossible red color, and the RV's engine was making a sound I'd never heard before. A wheeze, like something dying. Marcus moved to the driver's seat and turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click from the starter. "Try it again." He did, pumping the gas pedal, checking the lights, trying everything he could think of. The RV was completely dead. "It was fine this afternoon," he said. "The engine was running perfect." Outside, the scratching stopped. The tapping stopped. Even the rain seemed to quiet, though I could still see it streaming down the windows in crimson rivulets. The silence was worse than the noise had been. Maybe they're gone, Marcus whispered. I peered through the blinds, trying to see past the red fire still burning in our ring. The campsite looked empty, but something was wrong with the shadows. They were moving independently of the flames, stretching and twisting into shapes that hurt to look at. We need to call for help. Marcus already had his phone out, but I could tell from his expression what he was seeing. No signal. I checked mine. Same thing. Not even one bar, though we'd had full service when we arrived. A soft knock came at the door. 3 gentle taps, polite as could be. We froze, staring at the flimsy aluminum barrier between us and whatever was outside. The knock came again, still polite, still patient. "Please," came a child's voice through the door. The girl. "We just want to be warm." "Go away," I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "We can't," said one of the boys. "This is our home." "We've been waiting so long for visitors," said the other boy. "Please let us in," the girl said again. "We promise we won't hurt you. Much." That last word hit me like ice water. Marcus grabbed my hand, his palm slick with sweat. "What do you want?" he asked. Silence. Then, very softly, "To play." The scratching started again, all around the RV now. Dozens of small hands clawing at the aluminum siding, at the windows, at the roof. The sound was maddening, like fingernails on a chalkboard magnified 100-fold. "Stop it!" Marcus shouted. The scratching stopped instantly. "That's better." The girl's voice came from directly outside the window beside my head. I jerked away, nearly falling over the dinette table. "Now, will you please let us in?" "No." We asked nicely. The RV began to rock. Gentle at first, like a breeze, then more violently. Back and forth, side to side, as if something enormous was shaking us like a toy. I grabbed onto the kitchen counter, fighting to keep my balance. Marcus was thrown against the door, then across the narrow aisle into the bathroom. The rocking intensified, and I could hear things breaking. Dishes, the mirror in the bathroom, the TV mounted on the wall. "Stop!" I screamed. The rocking stopped. Outside, the children were laughing again, that horrible sound echoing from all around us. But now there were more voices. Not just 3 children, dozens of them, hundreds. All laughing at once, a chorus of the damned that seemed to go on forever. "How many of you are out there?" Marcus asked. "All of us," came the reply from everywhere and nowhere. Everyone who ever came to play and never left. I thought about the empty campground office, the key with our names already on it, the feeling that we'd been expected. "How long has this been going on?" "A very long time," the girl's voice said. "Since the bluffs first cast shadows. Since the caves first whispered secrets. We were the first, but we weren't the last. What happened to the others? They joined us. Eventually, the temperature inside the RV was dropping rapidly. I could see my breath in the red light filtering through the windows. Could feel frost forming on the metal surfaces around us. Marcus was shivering, his lips already blue. "It's getting cold," he said. "Very cold," agreed the children outside. "But it's warm in the ground. Warm and quiet and peaceful." Ice was forming on the inside of the windows now. Beautiful crystalline patterns that would have been lovely under different circumstances. But these crystals were forming shapes. Faces, reaching hands, screaming mouths. "We need heat," Marcus said through chattering teeth. I tried the RV's furnace, but like everything else, it was dead. The propane wouldn't light. Even our battery-powered lantern had gone dark, leaving us with only that impossible red glow seeping in from outside. "Please," I whispered, not sure if I was talking to the children or to God or to whatever force had brought us to this place. "Just let us go." "But you haven't played with us yet," the girl said. "And we've been so lonely. What kind of games do you want to play?" "Hide and seek. We hide, you seek. If you find us before sunrise, you can leave. And if we don't?" Silence. Then, very softly, "Then you stay and play forever." The frost inside the RV was thickening, coating everything in a layer of ice that glittered like diamonds in the red light. My fingers were going numb, and Marcus looked like he was about to collapse from hypothermia. "We don't have a choice," he said through blue lips. "We could wait it out, stay inside until morning. We'll freeze to death." I knew he was right. The temperature was dropping fast, too fast to be natural. In another hour, maybe two, we'd be popsicles. "Okay," I called out to the children. "We'll play your game." The cold stopped immediately. Not gradually, it just stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch. The ice on the windows began to melt, running down the glass like tears. "Wonderful," the children said in unison. "We're so excited. What are the rules?" "Simple. We hide somewhere in the park. You have until sunrise to find us, all three of us." "How will we know if we've found you?" "Oh, you'll know." The RV door opened by itself, swinging wide on well-oiled hinges. The red rain had stopped, but the fire was still burning in impossible crimson flames. Beyond the circle of light, the woods were darker than dark, a wall of blackness that seemed to swallow sound and light and hope. "We're already hidden," the children said. "Your time starts now." Marcus grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, but when he clicked it on, the beam was weak and yellow, barely penetrating the darkness beyond our campsite. My phone's flashlight was even worse. "Stay close to me," he said, and we stepped out into the night. The silence was complete now. No insects, no wind, no sound at all except our own breathing and footsteps. The woods seemed to press in around us, the trees closer together than they'd been during the day, their branches reaching toward us like grasping fingers. "Where do we even start?" I whispered. "The caves, maybe? Kids love caves." We made our way toward the nearest bluff, following what had been a trail during daylight but now seemed to shift and change direction every few steps. The beam of our flashlight revealed glimpses of the landscape around us. Twisted trees, moss-covered rocks, pools of water that reflected nothing. "There," Marcus said, pointing to a dark opening in the rock face ahead. "That looks like a cave." We approached cautiously, the flashlight beam probing the darkness inside. The cave mouth was narrow, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber beyond. "Hello?" I called out. "Are you in there?" My voice echoed back strangely, distorted, as if the sound was being filtered through water or thick fabric. We entered the cave, the temperature dropping again as we moved away from the entrance. The chamber was larger than it had looked from outside, with passages leading off in multiple directions. Our footsteps echoed hollowly, and somewhere in the darkness we could hear the sound of dripping water. "This place is a maze," Marcus said. "We could get lost in here. We're already lost." He was right. I'd lost track of which passage we'd entered through, and they all looked the same in the weak beam of our flashlight. Smooth stone walls carved by centuries of water flow, reaching into darkness that seemed to go on forever. That's when we heard it. A child's laughter echoing from deeper in the cave system. "Found you," Marcus called out, but the only answer was more laughter, coming from a different direction now. We followed the sound, stumbling through narrow passages and across underground streams, always hearing the laughter just ahead of us, just out of reach. The cave system was enormous, far larger than it should have been for this part of Arkansas. We passed chambers filled with flowstone formations, underground pools that glowed with their own sickly light, passages that seemed to spiral downward forever. "How long have we been in here?" I asked. Marcus checked his watch, but the face was dark. "Battery's dead." My phone was dead too, though it had been fully charged when we entered the cave. We pressed on, following the sound of children's voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. That's when we found the first one. The chamber opened up before us, cathedral-sized, with stalactites hanging like fangs from the ceiling. In the center, illuminated by that same impossible red light we'd seen at our campfire, stood the girl in the white pinafore. She was facing away from us, perfectly still, her long braids hanging down her back. But there was something wrong with her posture, something unnatural about the way she held her head. "Found you," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the vast space. The girl began to turn, slowly, mechanically, like a music box figure winding down. When she faced us, I saw why her posture had looked wrong. Her head was on backward. Her face was where the back of her head should have been, grinning at us with those black teeth, those bottomless eyes. "You found me," she said, her voice coming from the wrong direction, as if her vocal cords were still oriented the way they should have been. but I was never really hiding. She began to walk toward us, that horrible backward gait, her feet facing away from the direction she was moving. Marcus grabbed my hand and we ran, stumbling back through the passages, desperate to find our way out. But the cave had changed. Passages that had been there before were gone, replaced by smooth walls. New tunnels opened where none had been before. We were trapped in a shifting maze, with something that had once pretended to be a child hunting us through the darkness. "This way," I said, pulling Marcus toward what looked like an exit. But it wasn't an exit. It was another chamber, this one filled with bones. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered across the floor like a carpet of death. Human bones, but also others. Things with too many ribs, skulls with too many eye sockets, femurs twisted into impossible spirals. And standing among them, perfectly at home in this charnel house, were the two boys. "Found us too," they said in unison, their voices harmonizing in a chord that made my teeth ache. "Now there's only one game left to play." "What game?" "Tag," they said, grinning with mouths full of needle teeth. "You're it." They lunged at us with inhuman speed, and we ran. Through the bone chamber, down a passage that sloped sharply upward, following a faint current of air that might have meant an exit. Behind us, we could hear them coming. Not just the two boys, but all three children now, their footsteps echoing in impossible rhythms, their laughter building to a crescendo that threatened to burst my eardrums. We burst out of the cave, mouth gasping, back into the red-tinged night. The fire in our campsite was still burning, still that crimson color, but now I could see what was feeding it. Not wood, bones, human bones, charred black but somehow still burning, still radiating that hellish light. "The RV," Marcus gasped. "Maybe we can get it started now." But the RV was gone. In its place was a hole in the ground, perfectly circular, descending into darkness. Our campsite had become a crater, as if something enormous had erupted from beneath the earth. "Where?" I started to ask, but then I saw it. Our RV, sitting at the bottom of the hole, 50 feet down, crushed like an aluminum can. And surrounding it, standing in perfect formation, were the children. Not just the three we'd been playing hide-and-seek with, dozens of them. All different ages, all wearing clothes from different eras, all with those same black, ancient eyes. "You found us," the girl with the backward head called up from the crater. "But you didn't win the game." "Why not?" "Because there are so many more of us, and sunrise is still hours away." I looked up at the sky, searching for any sign of dawn. But there were no stars, no moon, just that pressing darkness that seemed to swallow everything. For all I knew, the sun would never rise again. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now you join us," the children said in unison, their voices creating a chorus that rose from the depths of the earth. "Now you play forever." The ground beneath our feet began to crumble, the edges of the crater expanding outward. We stumbled backward, trying to stay on solid ground, but there was nowhere to go. The entire campground was collapsing, sinking into some vast underground space that had been waiting beneath Devil's Den all along. I grabbed Marcus's hand as we slid down the crumbling slope, past layers of sediment and stone, past the bones of creatures that had fallen into this trap long before humans ever walked the earth. We landed hard on something that might once have been our RV, the metal groaning under our weight. The children surrounded us, their faces glowing with that red light, their eyes reflecting nothing. Up close, I could see that they weren't children at all. They were something wearing the shapes of children, something ancient and hungry and patient. "Welcome," the girl said, her head still twisted backwards, still grinning. "Welcome to the game that never ends." She reached out with one pale hand, and I saw that her fingers were too long, jointed in too many places, ending in nails that were black as her eyes. Behind her, the other children were changing too, their innocent faces melting away to reveal something underneath that my mind couldn't quite process. "Don't look at them," I whispered to Marcus. "Whatever you do, don't look directly at them." But it was too late. He was staring, transfixed, as the things that had pretended to be children revealed their true forms. I could see the sanity leaving his eyes, replaced by something else, a terrible understanding. a knowledge that no human mind was meant to contain. Marcus. He turned to look at me, and I saw that his eyes had started to change. Still brown, still human, but with flecks of black spreading through the iris like spilled ink. "I can see them now," he said wonderfully. "I can see what they really are. And Lily, they're beautiful." I backed away from him, from the thing that was wearing my boyfriend's face but speaking with a voice that was no longer entirely his own. The black flecks in his eyes were spreading, consuming more and more of the brown until they looked like dark pools reflecting nothing. "Join us," he said, reaching out with hands that were starting to elongate, fingers stretching into impossible lengths. "It doesn't hurt. It's actually quite peaceful." I ran. Up the crumbling walls of the crater, my hands scrabbling for purchase on loose stone and earth, fingernails breaking as I clawed my way toward what I hoped was the surface. Behind me, I could hear them laughing, Marcus's laugh mixing with the children's in a harmony that followed me up through the darkness. I reached the edge of the crater and kept running, through woods that seemed to shift and change around me, following paths that led in directions that shouldn't exist. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, until I collapsed beside a highway that definitely hadn't been there when we arrived. A trucker found me 3 hours later, soaked in red rain that tasted like blood, babbling about children with black eyes and caves that changed their shape. He took me to a hospital in Little Rock, where they sedated me and called it exhaustion. The police searched Devil's Den State Park but found no trace of Marcus, no trace of our RV, no crater where our campsite should have been. Site 17 was just an empty patch of grass with a fire ring and picnic table, exactly as it should be. They found no record of us ever registering for the campsite, no record of us renting the RV. According to their investigation, I'd driven to the park alone in a car I couldn't remember owning, and everything else was a stress-induced hallucination brought on by unemployment and relationship problems. Except I could remember now. Our apartment in Little Rock, a third-floor walk-up on Marshall Street. Marcus's job at the software company downtown. The layoffs, the bills, the gradual realization that he was slipping into depression and I was struggling to hold us both together. I could remember everything about our life before Devil's Den. But Marcus had been consumed by something that lived in the spaces between reality, something that fed on innocence and wore the faces of children to lure its prey. They released me from the hospital after 3 days of observation. I went back to our apartment, to the life we'd built together, but I could feel them watching me. The children. They'd found a way out of their underground prison, had followed me back to the world above. I see them sometimes, in reflections in windows, in the shadows cast by streetlights, in the static on TVs late at night. Always the same 3 faces. The girl with her head on backward, the 2 boys with their needle teeth and ancient eyes. They're patient. They know I'll slip eventually, will let my guard down long enough for them to finish what they started. And sometimes, late at night, I hear Marcus calling to me from the darkness between sleeping and waking. His voice is different now, older, but still unmistakably his. He's still down there, in that place beneath Devil's Den, playing games that never end with children who died before America was born. He wants me to come back. He wants me to join the game. And the terrible thing is, sometimes I think about it. Sometimes, in the loneliest hours before dawn, when the weight of living feels too heavy to bear, I think about how peaceful it would be to stop running, to stop being afraid, to let the black ink spread through my eyes until I can see the world the way they do. Beautiful, eternal, empty. The rain still tastes like blood when it falls, and every drop reminds me that some games never truly end. They just wait for you to realize you never really escaped at all.